November 2024 will go down as the month that shattered Putin's war machine. His so-called special military operation has turned into a special kind of disaster. Russia isn't just losing troops and tanks, it's losing the ability to fight altogether. Massive casualties, record equipment losses, and a collapsing ruble are hitting Russia all at once, threatening to bring Putin's entire war effort to its knees. This isn't just a bad month, it's the kind of month that could change everything. So why was November 2024 such a turning point, and what exactly went so wrong for Putin? The answer starts with troop losses. A lot of troop losses. On December 1st, the New Voice of Ukraine reported that Russia's army suffered its highest irrevocable and sanitary losses of the war so far in November 2024. The numbers make for terrible reading for Putin. A staggering 45,720 of his personnel were killed or injured during the month, according to Ukraine's defense ministry. That number is roughly equivalent to 3 entire motorized rifle divisions of the Russian army. Equipment losses were equally horrendous for Russia. Ukraine managed to destroy 307 of the country's tanks during November, adding to a tally that had already exceeded 9,500 by the time the month began. Those numbers may not have come as a surprise to Putin. Ukraine's defense ministry says that Ukraine managed to take out 279 tanks back in October, with another 291 falling to Ukraine soldiers in September. That's a 3-month average of a little over 292 tanks, showing that Putin is losing equipment hand over fist, while he's also losing soldiers. Alternatively, we can look at this in tank battalion terms. A single Russian tank battalion contains 31 of these monstrous machines. That means that November saw the country lose nearly 10 of its battalions, with September and October not being far behind. Add it all together, and the last 3 months have seen Putin lose a little over 28 of Russia's tank battalions. The monetary cost of the November tank losses is around $450 million. Add November to September and October, and Russia's financial losses in tanks alone easily tops $1 billion. And the equipment problems don't stop there. In December 2024, the Kyiv Independent reported that Russia also sacrificed 899 of its armored combat vehicles and 884 pieces of its artillery to the altar of Putin's special military operation. Again, those numbers add to the already catastrophic equipment losses that Russia has experienced since February 2022. The armored fighting vehicle destruction Ukraine wrought on Russia took the tally up to over 19,500 vehicles lost. Artillery systems lost had already pushed past the 21,000 mark for Russia, with Ukraine's November exploits putting it on the verge of breaking 21,000 pieces of artillery destroyed. The New Voice of Ukraine has the breakdown again. A single division of Russia's army has 18 self-propelled artillery installations. Assuming all 884 of the lost artillery pieces are self-propelled, that means Ukraine spent November 2024 decimating the capabilities of 49 of Russia's artillery divisions. As for the cost, that's another $700 million that Putin has poured down the drain as he tries to batter Ukraine's fortifications into submission. All told, the New Voice of Ukraine says Russia blew through $3 billion in lost equipment and weapons during the month. The country simply can't sustain these types of losses. Okay, so it was a bad month for Russia, you might think, but a single month doesn't mean that the country is on its knees. Perhaps Russia wouldn't care were it not for the fact that the record-breaking November losses came on the back of another month in which Russia broke records. That's right, October was almost as bad for Putin and his cronies in the Kremlin. On November 10th, the BBC reported that the UK's Chief of Defence Staff, Sir Tony Radakin, had called on the country's government to provide more money for its military. His goal is to increase the UK's defence budget from 2.3% of national gross domestic product or GDP to 2.5%. What does any of this have to do with Russia? Radakin also touched on Russia's losses for the month while making that call. He told the UK government that Putin was losing soldiers at a rate of about 1,500 every single day. He also pointed out that the country was then on the verge of suffering 700,000 people killed or wounded. The enormous pain and suffering that the Russian nation is having to bear because of Putin's ambition. It wouldn't take long for Radakin's predictions to come true. Russia's troop casualty toll now stands at about 753,000, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. On top of all this, Radakin added, Russia was experiencing those massive losses for tiny increments of land, and is now at a point where it's spending more than 40% of its national budget on the war. So not only is Putin losing his soldiers by the thousands every day, but he's putting an enormous strain on the state, according to Radakin. That gives us 2 record-breaking months of losses for Russia. October 2024 was bad enough. Losing around 1,500 soldiers a day is a casualty rate that Putin should never have allowed to happen. But then November 2024 came along and broke every record that Ukraine managed to set in the previous month. If we didn't know any better, we'd think that Putin was trying to break the back of his own country. Maybe he is. After all, it's not just the massive losses of personnel and the $3 billion in destroyed equipment that make November 2024 Russia's worst month ever. There are several other issues that threaten to cripple the country for good. Sticking with the troop loss issue for the moment, Russia didn't just experience its worst month for total losses in November, it also had to deal with its single worst day several times. On November 29th, the Kyiv Independent reported that the previous day saw Russia finally break through the 2,000 soldiers lost in a day barrier. Its final tally for November 28th, 2,030 soldiers dead or injured in a single day. And that wasn't even the first time the country had recorded its biggest ever single-day losses in November. Russia had only just set a new record of 1,950 casualties in a day on November 12th, and it had broken the record even before that. On November 11th, Kyiv released figures claiming that Russia had lost 1,770 of its troops on November 10th, which broke the record of 1,740 lost in a single day on May 13th. So what does that mean for Putin? November 2024 saw him break his own record for sacrificing his soldiers 3 times in the space of 18 days. And these weren't tiny increases. The November 12th record shattered the one set on November 10th by over 200 soldiers. The new record set on November 28th is 80 soldiers higher than the one set on November 12th. Russia is being forced to sit back and watch as its death count spirals out of control. And November just went from bad to worse for Putin and his army. On November 18th, news emerged that President Joe Biden had given Ukraine the green light to start using America's long-range ATACMS missiles in Russia. The United Kingdom followed suit by allowing Ukraine to use its Storm Shadow missiles to strike on Russian territory. Both decisions blindsided Putin. He'd hoped that his constant threats of retaliation for crossing this particular red line would have been enough to keep those missiles out of his country. They weren't. And Ukraine wasted no time in taking full advantage of its allies' decision. Just the day after it received approval from the US, Ukraine used its ATACMS missiles to mark the 1,000-day anniversary of the war with a strike on a Russian weapons depot in Bryansk. The attack was designed to take out missiles and artillery that would likely have found their way to the soldiers Putin was using to storm Kursk, meaning it came as a big logistical blow to Russia. About a week later, the Kremlin was also forced to admit that Ukraine had carried out 2 more ATACMS strikes on Russian facilities. Russia's defense ministry claimed that it shot down 7 of 8 missiles fired, with one hitting its target in one strike on an airfield named Kursk-Vostochny. The other strike targeted Russian S-400 positions in Lotarevka, with 3 missiles supposedly shot down while 2 reached their targets. Storm Shadow hasn't been left out of the fight. November 20th brought with it news of a strike using the UK-supplied missiles on what's believed to be a command headquarters in the village of Marino. The Guardian reports that Russian war bloggers believe that Ukraine fired 12 Storm Shadows in the attack, with the strike also believed to have taken out some of the North Korean soldiers Putin has received to supplement his counteroffensive in Kursk. So not only does Russia have to deal with losing record numbers of soldiers in November, but it also has to worry about Ukraine now having access to weaponry that could cause even more losses in December. Could it get any worse for Putin? As it happens, yes, it could absolutely get worse for Russia. As all of this was happening, the ruble was also falling off an economic cliff. Toward the end of November, the ruble cratered against the US dollar. By November 27th, it had fallen to its lowest rate since the beginning of Putin's special military operation, hitting 110 rubles per dollar. That's a stark contrast to the exchange rate in the months before the war, when the ruble traded at between 75 and 80, and the ruble kept falling. By November 29th, it was at 114, marking a 36% decline from the rate of 84 rubles per dollar recorded in August 2024. A small recovery has taken the ruble back below the 110 mark at the time of creating this video, but the currency having such a terrible exchange rate couldn't have come at a worse time for Putin. Sky News reported that panic reigned in the Kremlin as Russia was forced to watch its currency devalue. Kommersant, which is a daily Russian newspaper, said that the news resembled a war report, while telling its readers they needed to stash as many rubles as possible for the economic turbulence that is to come. This massive currency drop came in the wake of a new wave of US sanctions that targeted several Russian banks that allow the country to process international transactions. Gazprom Bank was the hardest hit. The bank, which is Russia's 3rd largest and has ensured that Russia can keep selling its natural gas to Europe, has now lost all of its ability to process transactions with other countries. That's a symptom of Europe spending the last couple of years collectively moving away from Russian gas. And even worse for Russia is that these new sanctions come amidst the country dealing with 8.7% inflation and a base interest rate of 21%, which has caused massive cost of living problems for the Russian population. So November has been a terrible month for Russia. On the battlefield, it's recorded its highest number of troop losses in a single month since the war began. It also broke its own record for single-day losses 3 times during the course of the month. Add to that the collapse of the ruble thanks to new US sanctions, and Ukraine's newly granted ability to use long-range missiles in Russian territory, and you get a month that's broken Russia's back. Let's hone back in on Russia's massive troop losses for November. Why did they happen? The answer likely lies in Russia making even bigger pushes against Ukraine throughout the month. We start with Kursk. In August 2024, Ukraine made the bold move of launching what ended up being a counter-invasion of Russia. Within 2 weeks of launching that invasion, Ukraine controlled 93 villages and around 450 square miles of Russian territory. The move was hailed as brilliant, albeit a big gamble at the time, because taking parts of Kursk would give Ukraine more leverage in any future peace negotiations with Russia. Putin wasn't happy. The Kursk invasion humiliated him and shattered his carefully crafted image as a political strongman who could protect his people. He needed to take the territory back, and he spent much of November 2024 trying to do just that. On November 12th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Ukrainian forces in Kursk were now holding the line against a counteroffensive containing 50,000 soldiers. Our men are holding back 50,000 of the occupier's army personnel who, due to the Kursk operation, cannot be deployed to the other Russian offensive directions on our territory, Zelensky announced. The 50,000 troops Putin has deployed in Kursk likely feature the majority of the 11,000 to 12,000 North Korean soldiers Russia has received as part of its cooperative defense pact with North Korea. It's believed that Russia is likely sending military technology and financial support to North Korea in exchange for these troops. Putin has made the ultimate sacrifice of Russian secrets, along with the cash the country can ill afford to spend, to bolster his counteroffensive, and it's working, partly. Russia's November push into Kursk had resulted in it taking back around 40% of the territory it lost by November 24th. But it's this very counteroffensive that also accounts for many of the country's massive losses during its record-breaking month. On November 1st, Pravda reported that Russia had lost 15 battalions, amounting to 8,000 soldiers, since Ukraine took territory in Kursk. By November 6th, amidst the launch of Putin's counteroffensive, that number had exceeded 20,000 troops, along with 1,101 units of weaponry and military equipment, according to Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Alexander Syrsky. More losses followed, with Russia also seeing 17 pieces of military equipment destroyed due to mine explosions during an attempted assault in mid-November. Add Ukraine's ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes in and around Kursk, along with its defense of the territory it's captured against Putin's counteroffensive, and you have a recipe for massive troop losses on the Russian side. And then there's another big ingredient we can add to that recipe. In addition to the Kursk counteroffensive, Russia has been pushing to take more territory in eastern Ukraine. It's been succeeding, in a sense. On November 30th, the New York Times reported that Russian soldiers had managed to take at least 10 villages in the latter third of the month, and were starting to close in on the last 2 strongholds Ukraine has in Donetsk. If those strongholds, Velkaya Novosilka and Kurakova, fall, that would allow Russia to take out the smaller pockets of Ukrainian troops that remain to ultimately take control over Donetsk. But that push has come at a massive cost. According to Operation Strategic Group Khortytsia, which is a unit of the ground forces Ukraine is stationed to the east, Russia's gains in November cost it a staggering amount of troops in eastern Ukraine. The group's spokesman Nazar Voloshin said, "November was a colossal month in terms of losses, and in particular, Russia suffered more than 35,000 casualties in our operational areas over the course of the month." Voloshin also said that the sheer number of Russian attacks in eastern Ukraine had intensified throughout November. "I should note that last week, the enemy conducted 1,156 attacks in our area of responsibility," he says, when referring to the final week of November. This is slightly more than the previous week, when there were 921 enemy attacks. This statement gives us some insight into how Putin is approaching his attempts to take Donetsk. Rather than relying on massive waves of soldiers, he's altered his tactics so that he now has small groups carrying out hundreds of assaults per day. The problem, at least according to Voloshin, is that Russia is deploying many of these small groups without armored vehicles or other key heavy equipment. That makes the groups easy picking for Ukraine soldiers, accounting for the massive casualty rate. It may be a different way of doing it, but it's still Putin's meat grinder approach in action. And therein lies the real reason why Russia has recorded record losses for November. It's now fighting the Ukraine war on 2 fronts, but Putin and his cronies still can't change their strategic approach. They're just throwing more and more soldiers at Ukrainian fortifications in the hope that they will eventually overwhelm the positions. The approach is working, slowly, but it's working at the cost of between 1,500 and 2,000 soldiers per day. So we come to the final question we'll ask in this video. What do these record-breaking numbers of troop losses mean for Putin? For one, Russia is starting to get desperate for a peace deal soon because it's running out of soldiers. That's according to The Conversation, which reveals that Russia is struggling to recruit the soldiers it needs to replenish its massive losses in Kursk and eastern Ukraine. That assertion is backed up by the fact that Putin has happily welcomed over 10,000 North Korean soldiers into his country to fight in Kursk. That's not something he would need to do if he was able to recruit enough soldiers to handle the problem himself, because taking those soldiers means he's now indebted to North Korean President Kim Jong-un. Russia doesn't want to be in this position. Its closest ally in the war is the only nation that is more of a global pariah than Russia. There's also the more tangible recruitment problems Russia faces. The BBC reports that NATO and Western military officials believe that Putin is managing to recruit around 20,000 new soldiers to Russia's military every month. Think about what that means in the context of November's record-breaking losses. Russia is only recruiting less than half the soldiers it needs to account for the losses as massive as the 45,720 experienced in November. Even more worrying for Russia is that these 20,000 per month are predominantly brand new soldiers. Some may be mercenaries and others with experience in combat, but most are wet behind the ears and likely to be sent to the front lines within weeks of recruitment, where they'll offer little more than being cannon fodder for Ukraine's guns. Putin is trying to get around this problem. At the beginning of November, Russia changed how it delivered draft notices. Rather than sending them via mail, the military now delivers them online. As soon as the notice arrives in an inbox, whoever receives it is immediately barred from leaving Russia, else they'll face stiff penalties, including jail sentences. No man in Russia is safe from this approach, assuming that the state has their records. Paying tax, renewing a driver's license, and anything else that requires interaction with state services is enough for the unfortunate individual to put themselves in line for Putin's draft. The tactics aren't going to work. Putin has already broken Russia's back when it comes to manpower. He's using these types of sneaky tactics to get more recruits because he's terrified of the public backlash he'll face if he creates a new round of mobilization. The simple fact is that Russia is running out of people to send to the front lines at a time when it's losing more soldiers than ever before. November 2024 may have been the month when Russia made substantial gains in eastern Ukraine and managed to retake 40% of its lost territory in Kursk. However, it's also the month where it broke records for the number of its soldiers lost or killed on the battlefield. When combined with the collapse of the ruble and Ukraine's newfound ability to launch long-range missiles at Russia, we may well be looking at the beginning of the end of Putin's ability to sustain his intense assaults on Ukrainian positions. But what do you think about Russia's November 2024 losses? Will Putin be able to replenish his ailing military with more people and equipment? Or is Russia's leader just waiting for President-elect Donald Trump to introduce his peace plan so he can exit his special military operation while claiming some semblance of a victory? How do you mark the 1,000th day of a war that has devastated your country? If you're Ukraine, you waste no time at all in taking advantage of the United States finally permitting you to use its long-range missiles against your enemy. On November 19th, Ukraine launched a volley of ATACMS missiles at Russia, absolutely obliterating everything that lay in the missile's path. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has just sent a clear message to Russia. We finally got what we wanted all along, and we're not afraid to use it. ATACMS missiles are going to fly, and there are dozens of key Russian positions within their range. This first strike is just the start, as Ukraine plans to turn so many of Russia's most important strategic locations into fiery pits on the ground. Happy 1,000-day anniversary. Here we're going to share all of the details about Ukraine's ATACMS missile strike, including what happened and what it means for the future of the war. We'll also detail the Russian response to both the strike and the news that the US has finally permitted Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles in Russian territory. We start with what actually happened. On November 18th, news emerged that US President Joe Biden had finally permitted Ukraine to use long-range ATACMS, which is a missile system, on Russian territory. The missiles present a clear threat to Putin's plan for Ukraine. Assuming Ukraine has received the modern Block 1A variant of the missile system, it's now capable of striking up to around 186 miles inside Russian territory. Each ATACMS can be loaded with a high explosive or blast fragmentation warhead, the latter breaking up into 950 sub-munitions and can move at speeds in excess of Mach 3 in the air. Worse yet for Russia, the missiles are road mobile. That means Ukraine can transport them to anywhere in its territory before firing them at a target. November 19th brought with it the first use of what is sure to be many displays of the ATACMS' devastating power. The BBC was among the first to write a report on the Ukraine missile strike. It says US officials confirmed that Ukraine had launched an ATACMS strike within the Bryansk region that borders Ukraine to its north. If that region sounds familiar, it's because Ukraine tried to breach the region's borders in October 2024, just a few short months after its soldiers had taken territory in Kursk. Ukraine has definitely made Bryansk a target, not least because it hosts an airfield from which Russia can launch glide bombs and provides a potential route into its territory for Russian soldiers. The fact that Bryansk neighbors Kursk also isn't lost on Ukraine. The region is likely part of a supply chain that's feeding equipment to the 50,000 soldiers Russian President Vladimir Putin is using in his ongoing Kursk counteroffensive. But back to the ATACMS missiles. News of exactly what the strike hit was sketchy early on. The BBC reports that Russia's defense ministry claimed that Ukraine had fired 5 ATACMS, 4 of which were shot down before reaching their targets. The one that got through didn't score a direct hit, according to Russia, but fragments from the missile caused a fire at a military facility. That Russian report is typically minimalistic in the sense that it's trying to downplay the damage caused. According to US officials who confirmed the missile strike for the BBC, Ukraine had actually fired 8 missiles, with Russia only managing to take out 2 of them while they were en route. AP News followed up on those official claims. One of the officials said that the United States was still trying to assess the damage that Ukraine caused. However, early signs suggest that the missiles touched down on an ammo depot located in SKYROCKET, which is a city of around 18,000 people in the Bryansk region. As for Ukraine, it remained tight-lipped on the whole matter. Zelensky was quizzed about the missile strike during a news conference in its aftermath, but wouldn't confirm whether Ukraine had used ATACMS. Instead, he hinted that it had, stating, "Ukraine has long-range capabilities, including domestically produced long-range drones, and now we have ATACMS as well." A cagey response from the president, but it's certainly no outright denial that Ukraine took full advantage of the US lifting restrictions on ATACMS usage on the war's 1000th anniversary. Zelensky's mention of drones seems to stem from the fact that Ukraine accompanied its ATACMS strike with a concerted drone assault. Reuters reported that Russia claims to have shot down 42 Ukrainian drones on the same evening that the ATACMS strike took place, with 32 of those drones being in the Bryansk region. Ukraine's tactic is made clear. It sent drones along with its missiles to confuse Russia's anti-air defenses, forcing them to focus on the less dangerous unmanned aerial vehicles ahead of the massive missiles heading Bryansk's way. Coming back to Zelensky's comments at the news conference, any doubt about Ukraine's ATACMS usage disappeared when footage of the strike started to emerge. The Warzone, or TWZ's report on Ukraine's 1,000-day anniversary attack, offered more details, along with videos showcasing the devastation Ukraine's ATACMS caused. It noted that the specific target appeared to be Russia's 67th arsenal of the Russian main missile and artillery directorate. So Ukraine has used its ATACMS to attack Russian missile stores. TWZ also reported on videos from the strike that showed a massive fireball rising over the weapons base, followed by what sounds like a series of smaller explosions that may have been caused by ATACMS fragments detonating Russian weapons. And though Zelensky was cagey in response to the ATACMS question, his own military officials seemed to have looser tongues. Speaking to RBC Ukraine, an unnamed informed source within Ukraine's defense forces said, "Indeed, ATACMS was used for the first time to strike the territory of the Russian Federation. The strike was carried out on a facility in the Bryansk region. It was successfully destroyed." The words "successfully destroyed" indicate the strike was far more damaging than a few missile fragments causing some fires, as Russia tried to claim. More confirmation came from a different Ukrainian official who told the Washington Post that Ukraine had indeed used ATACMS to attack Bryansk in an overnight strike. So what does this 1,000-day anniversary strike mean for Russia and Ukraine? In the immediate sense, Ukraine has managed to take out an ammunition depot that stored valuable weapons. Posting on the social media platform Telegram, the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council head, Andriy Kovalenko, outlined why this is a massive win for Ukraine. By taking out the ammo depot, it's destroyed artillery ammunition, air-to-ground and anti-aircraft missiles, and a slew of ammunition Russia uses in its multiple launch rocket systems. Those are all weapons that Russia can no longer use to attack Ukraine on its own territory from the supposed safety of Bryansk. They're also weapons that Russia can't ship to Kursk to support Putin's counteroffensive against the Ukrainian troops fortified within the region. In one fell swoop, Ukraine has taken out a key supply line and raised the chances of its soldiers holding out against the 50,000 Russians and North Koreans in Kursk. Taking a wider view, Ukraine launching ATACMS at Russia signifies both a change in the nature of the war and a potential escalation on both sides. That escalation started with Russia. We just mentioned that Russia is using North Korean soldiers in its Kursk counteroffensive. Those soldiers began arriving in October 2024 thanks to the well-timed Cooperative Defense Pact Putin signed with North Korean President Kim Jong-un back in June 2024. Putin had already escalated the Ukraine war to directly involve other nations before this 1,000-day anniversary strike, with Biden's decision to permit ATACMS usage possibly being a reaction to North Korea's involvement. More worrying for Ukraine is another escalation pushed through by Putin in the immediate aftermath of Biden's ATACMS decision. Russian rhetoric went into overdrive as soon as the Kremlin learned that Ukraine could use long-range missiles on its territory. Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, claimed that it's clear that the outgoing administration in Washington intends to take steps to continue to add fuel to the fire and further inflame tensions around the conflict when the news of Biden's approval emerged. Russia's foreign ministry followed up, claiming that it would see any use of US-provided ATACMS on Russian territory as evidence of America's direct involvement in hostilities against the Russian Federation. Russia's response in such a case will be appropriate and palpable. Those comments laid the groundwork for Vladimir Putin's choice to make amendments to the Russian nuclear doctrine just hours before Ukraine launched its 1,000th day ATACMS strike. First proposed in September 2024, the BBC says those changes set out new conditions under which Russia could launch nuclear weapons at an opponent. Specifically, the doctrine now states that any attack conducted by a non-nuclear state, if said country is backed by a nuclear state, would be considered a joint assault against Russia. And with that attack, both states would open themselves up to a nuclear response from Russia. This represents a massive change from Russia's previous doctrine, which stated that Russia may use nuclear weapons if an enemy conducted a nuclear attack on its territory or attacked using conventional weapons that threaten the Russian Federation's existence. Putin's message with this amendment was clear. Any use of ATACMS could provoke a nuclear response from Russia on Ukraine, the United States, or both. Mere hours later, Ukraine conducted its ATACMS strike on Bryansk. Thankfully, the strike hasn't prompted an immediate nuclear retaliation from Russia, and Putin's doctrine changes haven't come as a surprise to the US State Department. Spokesman Matthew Miller said, "I'm unfortunately not surprised by the comments the Kremlin has made around the publication of this new, revised document." He points to the change as another attempt by Putin to coerce and intimidate both Ukraine and other countries around the world through irresponsible nuclear rhetoric. Washington also has no plans to change its own nuclear doctrine, which still positions nuclear weapons as a responsive measure to a nuclear attack on American soil. Still, there's no denying that Ukraine's ATACMS strike falls exactly in line with the new Russian doctrine. According to Putin's own revised version of the laws, Russia will be within its rights to respond with nuclear weapons, showing just how well-timed the doctrine amendments are. Whether he does or not remains to be seen, though the Kremlin has noted that Ukraine's strike marks a new phase of the Western war. Russia is right, and that brings us to what the future holds for the Ukraine war. On Ukraine's end, its ATACMS strike showcases that there are no restrictions on where or how it uses ATACMS on Russian territory. When news of Biden's policy reversal started filtering through, some commentators speculated that Ukraine would only be able to use the weapons in Kursk. That would have made sense. Remember that Biden's decision appears to be a direct result of Russia using North Korean soldiers in its Kursk counteroffensive. Limiting ATACMS usage to the region would have allowed the US to argue that it's only giving Ukraine the weapons it needs to defend itself from an escalation that shouldn't have happened in the first place. But Ukraine's first ATACMS strike took place in Bryansk. So that argument goes out of the window, which means more headaches than Russia might have anticipated are coming. According to the Institute for the Study of War, the range of the ATACMS means that Ukraine has the ability to strike at least 245 known Russian military objects outside of Ukraine. Among these 245 are 16 airfields, several of which are home to the aircraft Russia is using to launch glide bombs at Ukraine from behind the front lines. There are also 15 known objects in Kursk alone, though that figure seems less relevant now that it's clear Ukraine can use ATACMS to strike outside of the contested oblast. Russia now has to contend with a Ukraine that's capable of taking out key airfields, reducing Putin's use of glide bombs considerably. That's a problem for Russia. It's launched thousands of glide bombs at Ukraine because it can do so from the relative safety of its airfields behind the front lines without risking its aircraft. By taking out these aircraft with ATACMS, Ukraine will be able to relieve pressure on its soldiers on the ground, particularly in the Donbass region, which has been a key focus for Putin during much of 2024. And of course, Ukraine can cause massive disruption to Russian supply lines with ATACMS. We can see that from this first strike in Bryansk. Ukraine has targeted a specific ammunition depot to deprive Russian forces of missiles and artillery shells. Again, pressure is relieved on Ukraine, only this time the attack may help its forces in Kursk, because those Bryansk weapons may have found their way into Russia's counteroffensive in the region. The point is that Ukraine can now hit far more Russian targets than it could before, and that will have Putin worried. Another concern for Putin is that the ATACMS levels the playing field in terms of the strength of the responses Ukraine can conjure to Russia's attacks. For the entire war so far, Russia has used missiles and bombs to hit Ukrainian territory without having to worry about much in the way of responses on its own land. Russia has taken advantage of that fact right up until Ukraine's Bryansk first strike. For instance, just hours before Ukraine used ATACMS in Bryansk, Russia conducted a devastating drone strike on Ukraine that left 12 people dead, including one child. It was the third such strike in as many days, with the attack, which used a Shahid drone made in Iran, also injuring 11 people, with more potentially being trapped under rubble. November 18th saw Russia fire a missile at Odessa, causing an apartment fire that killed at least 10 and injured 43, and the day before, it had fired a ballistic missile containing cluster munitions at Sumy, killing 11 and wounding 84. Here we see Russia's hypocrisy come into play. It's constantly warned Ukraine not to attack it on its own territory using weapons Ukraine has received from foreign partners, but it holds itself to no such standard. Iranian Shahid drones and North Korean artillery are regularly used to batter Ukrainian fortifications and cities. With ATACMS, Ukraine now has more options to counter these attacks on its territory. The ATACMS represents a clear threat to any Russian settlement or fortification within around 180 miles of the country's border with Ukraine. The complexion of the war changes as a result, with Putin's missiles and drone attacks on Ukrainian population centers now potentially being met in kind. All of this amounts to leverage for Ukraine. With its Kursk invasion in August 2024, Ukraine captured around 460 square miles of Russian territory. That was land that it will likely hope to use as a bargaining chip to regain some of what it's lost to Putin's special military operation should Ukraine and Russia ever come to the negotiating table. Being able to use ATACMS inside Russia and showcasing its willingness to do so grants even more leverage to Ukraine. The country can now argue that it's fully capable of retaliating to Russian strikes on its territory in kind, and its missiles can travel far enough to damage key infrastructural and military targets inside Russia. Perhaps Ukraine can use this fact to demonstrate to Putin that Bryansk is just the start. If he doesn't stop attacking Ukraine, then more ATACMS strikes on his territory will follow. All of this remains to be seen. However, maintaining that sort of leverage depends on Ukraine keeping its ability to use ATACMS in Russia when the US presidency transitions to Donald Trump in January 2025. There's no guarantee of that happening. The immediate Republican response to Biden's decision to permit ATACMS usage inside Russia was muted at best. TWZ reports that Trump's national security advisor Mike Waltz has criticized the decision. Waltz, a former National Guard colonel and Green Beret, who is now a Florida congressman, described Biden's decision as another step up the escalation ladder. Considering Waltz is likely to become a national security advisor under Trump's presidency, these responses would suggest that the incoming administration is already considering reversing Biden's decision. That would be damaging to Ukraine in the context of allowing it to use ATACMS strikes as leverage against Russia, but the reversal may come amidst President-elect Trump's push for peace with the plan he said he'll introduce when he enters office. Perhaps Ukraine struck so quickly in Bryansk because it's uncertain whether it'll have permission to use ATACMS in Russia for more than a couple of months. Again, we can't say for certain. And we also can't ignore the fact that Biden's permission does appear to have escalated the Ukraine war. Nuclear weapons are now on the table for Russia. Granted, it's threatened nuclear action plenty of times in the past as a response to Ukraine and its partners crossing red lines in the war. But this time, it's changed its nuclear doctrine to allow itself to retaliate to an attack, just like the one Ukraine conducted in Bryansk. So Ukraine has absolutely obliterated a Russian ammunition depot on the 1000th day of the war. It's proven that it's willing to use long-range missiles it's craved for so long right off the bat. But the 1000-day anniversary also marks the point where Russia's nuclear doctrine has changed, marking a turning point in the war on both sides of the conflict. Does that turning point favor Ukraine or Russia? We'll leave the answer to that question up to you. Is Russia's alteration of its doctrine just another example of the nuclear saber-rattling we've seen throughout the war? How much damage do you think Ukraine can do beyond the Bryansk strike in the months to come? 1,000 days. That's how long Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has dragged on. 1,000 days into a war that was supposed to last just 3, Russia finds itself in freefall. Ukraine, against all odds, has turned the tide, not just holding the line, but grinding Russia's military into dust. Staggering troop losses, shattered equipment, and crumbling morale paint a grim picture for the Kremlin. Putin's grand gamble has backfired spectacularly, and the cracks in his war machine are now impossible to ignore. But what sealed Russia's fate? The answer lies in a daring moment that reshaped the battlefield: the Kursk incursion. On August 6, 2024, Ukraine launched a surprise offensive into Russia's Kursk Oblast, catching Moscow completely off guard. Ukrainian forces quickly breached Russian defenses, capturing dozens of square miles of Russian territory within the first few days. By the end of the first week, Ukraine had secured around 386 square miles of land, and Russian authorities had been forced to declare a state of emergency. In other words, it took Ukrainian troops only a week to show the world just how fragile Russia's position truly is. Naturally, for Russia, this incursion was a humiliating blow. After all, we aren't talking about a border skirmish, we're talking about a full-scale breach into Russian territory. A breach that awarded Putin a not-so-flattering title, the first Russian leader in modern history to have foreign troops on Russian soil. However, the Ukrainian troops haven't been just holding ground, they've been inflicting serious damage on Russia's military infrastructure. Ukrainian artillery and drones have been hammering Russian positions, leaving a trail of destroyed vehicles, tanks, and equipment. But that's not even the worst part. Thousands of Russian soldiers have also been sent to an early grave, with each day claiming more of the country's already strained forces. To put it simply, it's a slaughter for Russia. A slaughter that shows no signs of slowing down. In fact, it only seems to be getting worse. The deadliest days for Russian troops are no longer early 2022 when the invasion first began. They're now in November 2024, as the battlefield becomes more unforgiving with every passing day. But words alone don't do justice to the scale of these losses. The numbers tell the true story of Russia's unraveling. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost 725,740 troops from February 24, 2022 to November 20, 2024. That's nearly 750,000 lives shattered in less than 3 years, and the toll keeps rising. As of November 20th, the deadliest day for Russian troops was November 11th, when they lost nearly 2,000 soldiers, or 1,950 to be precise. To put this into perspective, that's almost as many military personnel the United States lost during 20 years of war in Afghanistan. Yes, you heard that right. Between October 7, 2001 and August 30, 2021, the US suffered a total of 2,324 combat deaths. Russia nearly matched this number in casualties in just 24 hours. The scale of this bloodshed truly defies comprehension. But November 11th was no isolated incident. The record that was broken that day was set the day before, on November 10th, which was also reported as Russia's deadliest day since the beginning of the invasion, with 1,770 losses. The previous record, 1,740 Russian losses, was set on May 13th, mere days after Russia launched an offensive operation in Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast. But this doesn't mean that the early days of November were merciful for Russia. On November 8th, the country lost 1,660 troops. On November 4th, it was 1,260. November 1st claimed 1,270. You get the picture. October, previously the deadliest month for Russian forces, recorded 41,980 casualties, an average of roughly 1,350 per day. Yet November is shaping up to surpass even that grim milestone, with the last few days in November recording losses well over 1,500 a day. November 19th, 1,690. November 18th, 1,610. November 17th, 1,560. November 16th, 1,640. November 15th, 1,650. November 14th, 1,520. November 13th, 1,690. November 12th, 1,770. This devastation has led many to label what's unfolding in Kursk as nothing short of a massacre. Videos circulating online show hundreds of Russian vehicles obliterated, some with troops still inside, highlighting the utter futility of Moscow's repeated assaults. Of course, Russia wouldn't be Russia if it didn't try to spin things around. Russian soldiers have also been posting videos and photos of their battleground successes in Kursk. One such instance involves a Russian soldier proudly posing next to a Ukrainian Leopard 2 tank that his unit supposedly hit and captured. Given that Leopard 2 tanks are highly advanced and relatively scarce in Ukraine's arsenal, this was quite the achievement, right? Well, not quite. Upon closer inspection, this tank turned out to be nothing more than a decoy. A well-crafted decoy, but a decoy nonetheless. This bizarre display of desperation perfectly sums up the contrast between Russia's propaganda and the reality on the ground. This contrast has become so significant that Russian commanders have reportedly been arrested for exaggerating battlefield gains. According to recent reports, these arrests stem from Moscow's growing frustration with the gap between the glowing victories portrayed in state media and the catastrophic losses being suffered in Kursk. In a shocking turn of events, several mid-level and senior officers were accused of fabricating reports to appease higher-ups, overstating territorial gains and inflating Ukrainian losses. The goal of these false claims was to shield the commanders from criticism and disciplinary actions. However, they only managed to fuel the Kremlin's delusions about the state of the war. Yet another major miscalculation. So now, with Kursk turning into a disaster of unprecedented scale, the Kremlin's crackdown on its own commanders showcases the chaos and paranoia within Russia's military leadership. However, the fact that Russian commanders felt compelled to do this in the first place exposes another thing. The Russian chain of command is completely fractured. But as the Kursk debacle continues, no amount of doctor reports or arrests can mask the truth of Russia's mounting failures. But it's not just manpower that's being bled dry. Russia's equipment is also taking a brutal beating. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, as of November 20th, Russia has lost an astounding 9,390 tanks, 19,119 armored vehicles, and 20,681 artillery systems. These losses also extend to Russia's aerial and naval fleet, with 369 airplanes, 329 helicopters, and 28 ships and boats destroyed. Even drones, a crucial tool for modern warfare, haven't escaped unscathed. Over 19,202 Russian unmanned aerial vehicles have been taken out of action so far. November alone has added significantly to these staggering totals. In just one day, November 19th, Ukrainian forces reportedly took out 8 tanks, 27 armored personnel vehicles, 49 artillery systems, and 91 drones. And remember the deadliest day for the Russians, November 11th? Well, that single day claimed 23 tanks and 81 armored personnel vehicles. November added a couple more dismal milestones to Russia's depressing track record. As of November 20th, Russia has officially lost over 1,000 anti-aircraft systems. While Russia passed 4 digits in this department, it's quickly approaching a devastating 5-digit number in total. A total of 29,648 vehicles and fuel tanks have been lost so far, with November 19th adding another 100 to the tally. It's only a matter of time before Russia's vehicle losses surpass the mind-blowing 30,000 mark. Each new day seems to bring another chapter of devastation to Moscow's war effort, and the worst part is that Russia cannot possibly replace these vital resources at the pace required. Now, you might wonder, isn't Russia's economy on a war footing? With all the resources pouring into the defense industry, how is it possible that it can't keep up? Well, the answer is simple. The losses are just too big. Russia's production lines, stretched to their limits, simply can't match the ferocious pace of destruction. Take large-caliber cannon barrels, for instance. According to Oryx, a Dutch open-source intelligence defense analysis website that records documented equipment losses, Russia loses over 320 tank and artillery cannon barrels per month. However, Russia's 2 rotary forges, critical for producing these components, can churn out only 20 barrels monthly. That's a replacement rate of less than 7%. A catastrophic mismatch. Worse still, Russia can't expand its production capacity because the skills and equipment required are controlled by specialist firms abroad, such as Austria's GFM, and given the sanctions, the prospect of acquiring any necessary parts is close to zero. Fighting vehicles tell a similar story. Since the war began, Russia has lost roughly 155 infantry fighting vehicles, according to Oryx. Russian defense manufacturers can produce about 200 per year, or approximately 17 per month, which means they have the capacity to replenish these losses in less than a year. However, sustaining this level of production while also dealing with other categories of equipment losses and maintaining combat operations stretches Russian industry to its limits. Even with the older models scavenged from Soviet-era stockpiles, these reserves won't last indefinitely, raising questions about Russia's ability to keep up over the long term. Russia's artillery production has reportedly tripled to an annual rate of 3 million shells, which sounds impressive. Well, that is until you consider its consumption rate. While Russia is no longer firing the 12 million rounds expended in 2022, estimates suggest its current usage still far outstrips production. This has forced Moscow to rely heavily on imports, such as North Korean shells, which now make up nearly 50% of the artillery used in Ukraine. But shells aren't the only thing coming from North Korea. Beyond artillery, North Korea has provided long-range rocket and artillery systems, including 50 domestically produced 170mm M1989 self-propelled howitzers and 20 upgraded 240mm multiple-launch rocket systems. These contributions mark a deepening military partnership between Moscow and Pyongyang. one that shows just how destroyed Russia's defense capabilities are. However, North Korean contributions to the equipment department weren't the most controversial. North Korean troops have arrived in Russia too. As of early November, Pyongyang has deployed around 11,000 soldiers to bolster Russia's efforts in the Kursk Oblast. At the same time, reports suggest that this number could increase in the coming weeks. Divided into assault and support units, these North Korean forces are now integral to Russia's strategy in the region. Yet these troops face significant vulnerabilities. They're poorly trained and equipped, lack battle experience, and don't even understand the language spoken around them. That's why many military experts have labeled them as nothing more than cannon fodder for the Russians. Of course, their involvement speaks volumes about the sheer scale of Moscow's manpower losses. It's obvious that Putin is desperately trying to plug the gaps, as Russia's domestic recruitment and conscription efforts are failing to sustain the war. This makes the growing cooperation between Russia and North Korea far from the triumph Putin's propagandists might claim. No, this partnership reeks of desperation. Faced with battlefield attrition rates it can't match and an economy teetering under the weight of war, Moscow has turned to one of the few nations willing to defy sanctions openly. Speaking of Russia's economy, it also has "finished" written all over it, just like Putin's efforts in Ukraine. Sure, on paper this economy might look solid. Russia's gross domestic product, GDP, is growing. Unemployment has hit a historic low of 2.4% and wages have skyrocketed. But this rosy picture hides severe structural problems, driven by the so-called military Keynesianism, an unsustainable, war-fueled economic boost. The defense industry alone has absorbed 500,000 workers, while the armed forces require 30,000 fresh recruits each month to replace casualties. The labor market is so strained that defense firms have had to increase wages five-fold, pushing inflation to 8.68% as of October. These increased wages might attract workers, but they still come at a steep cost. Other sectors, particularly those vital to the civilian economy, are suffering from acute labor shortages. Meanwhile, Moscow's lavish military bonuses have created a financial black hole that the civilian economy simply can't fill. Perhaps that's why the Kremlin has resorted to one of its most cynical moves yet, slashing compensation for wounded soldiers. In a November 13th decree signed by Putin, Russia introduced a sliding scale for injury payouts, cutting what was once a flat payment of roughly $30,000 for any injury to a drastically reduced amount based on the severity of the wounds. Under the new system, only soldiers with the most catastrophic injuries, classified as Section 1 and including severe spinal damage, brain trauma, or life-threatening organ damage, will receive the full $30,000 or 3 million rubles. For less severe but still debilitating injuries such as concussions or gunshot wounds not affecting organs, the payout drops to 1 million rubles or $10,000. And for truly minor injuries, soldiers will receive a paltry 100,000 rubles or roughly $1,000, barely enough to cover basic medical treatment. This cost-cutting measure is a flagrant betrayal of the soldiers who have already paid an immense price for Putin's war. Soldiers suffering from fractures or other injuries that may have long-lasting impacts on their lives are now treated as though their suffering doesn't matter. What was once a gesture of recognition for the hardships of war is now reduced to a cold, calculated formula. But the real sting comes when you consider the financial realities in Russia. With the rising inflation rate of 8% to 8.68%, even the 100,000 rubles for minor injuries will quickly lose their value. This means that the soldiers won't even be taken care of in the short term, let alone in the long run. For many, this is a painful reminder that they are seen as nothing more than expendable resources. However, for Russia, this miserly move was the only viable option, as the war's costs spiral out of control. A 2024 analysis estimated that casualty payouts alone could amount to 2.3 trillion rubles, which is equivalent to $26 billion. That's roughly 6% of the entire national budget. Faced with this financial hemorrhaging, Moscow is choosing to save rubles at the expense of the very people it sent to fight its war. But it gets worse. While the Kremlin trims compensation for injured troops, it continues to pour money into military bonuses. Lavish signing bonuses are swallowing resources that could otherwise be used to support those injured in service. Basically, Putin is sending a clear message to his people. You'll be paid handsomely to join, but once you leave, you're on your own. That's if you even get to leave. With this in mind, it's no wonder that morale has hit an all-time low among the Russian ranks. But unsurprisingly, Putin doesn't care. He's reportedly ordered the retake of Kursk at all costs. There's even a deadline for recapturing full control over the region, February 1st, 2025. That's not even 2 weeks after the newly re-elected US President Donald Trump is set to be sworn into office. While the deadline was reportedly set up before Trump was re-elected, we can't help but wonder about the peculiar timing. With no regard for the lives of his soldiers, Putin is launching his forces forward with the same reckless abandon as at the start of the war. Column after column of Russian vehicles are pushing forward, charging headfirst into Ukraine's prepared defensive positions, despite the significant losses and strategic setbacks. So why the rush? Well, Putin is clearly trying to grab as much negotiating leverage as possible ahead of any potential diplomatic overture to the new US president. By regaining this territory, he will be able to present a victory of sorts to Trump, or at least a strong negotiating position to secure a deal that could be seen as a win for Moscow. But as you've already heard in this video, this all-out push isn't exactly going according to plan. And now, while President Joe Biden is still in office, the US has thrown a major wrench into Russia's plans. He's given Ukraine an all-clear to use US-supplied long-range missiles on Russian soil. This decision marks a monumental shift in the dynamics of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Biden's move, taken on November 17th, followed months of Ukrainian pleas for more potent weapons to strike Russian infrastructure and military targets beyond the front lines. At first, the US resisted providing such weapons for fear of escalating the conflict. However, Moscow's provocative actions, especially the deployment of North Korean soldiers among the 50,000 troops in Kursk, finally prompted a change in Washington's stance. The immediate impact of this policy change was felt just 2 days later, on November 19th, when Ukrainian forces reportedly launched an ATACMS missile against a key Russian munitions storage facility in Karachev, Bryansk Oblast. This attack marked the first time that the US-supplied long-range missiles were used on Russian soil. The target, a vital arsenal of Russia's main missile and artillery directorate, was reportedly destroyed in a dramatic explosion that sent fireballs soaring into the sky. Residents even captured the moment on video, showing the scale of the blast that rocked the region. Ukrainian officials confirmed that the munitions stored at this facility included artillery ammunition and anti-aircraft missiles, which are critical supplies for Russia's ongoing offensive. But why is this strike seen as a turning point in the war? Well, the ATACMS, with a range of up to 190 miles, allows Ukraine to target high-value Russian assets far from the front lines. The weapon's precision and capability to strike so deep within Russian territory will undoubtedly put immense pressure on Moscow's military infrastructure. However, it's important to note that this isn't just about military targets. It's about crippling Russia's ability to resupply its forces and sustain operations across multiple fronts, and this strike is just the beginning. The US decision has allowed Ukraine to incorporate long-range capabilities from other NATO allies, including France and the UK, into its arsenal. These nations are now preparing to send their own long-range missiles to Ukraine, which notably include the Storm Shadow missiles, with a range of 310 miles. These missiles are designed to be launched from fighter jets, further increasing the diversity and reach of Ukraine's strikes within Russian territory. Other NATO allies are likely to follow suit. This means that Russia, which had become accustomed to operating with relative impunity on its own soil, will now be vulnerable to direct attacks that can cripple its logistics, command centers, and military resources. For Putin, this represents a nightmare scenario, a war on two fronts, one in Ukraine and one within his own borders. Moscow's response to this new reality has been predictably hostile. Russian officials, including Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov, have described the US decision as a dangerous escalation and a new phase of direct US involvement in the conflict. Peskov even warned that this would lead to greater tension between Russia and the West. As for Putin, he did what he does best: resort to the good old nuclear saber-rattling. This time, he dramatically lowered Russia's threshold for using nuclear weapons. Previously, Russia's nuclear doctrine allowed for the use of nuclear weapons only in case of a nuclear attack or an existential conventional attack, one that threatened the very survival of the state. However, the new doctrine now states that Russia could respond with nuclear weapons to any critical threat to its sovereignty and territorial integrity, even if the threat comes in the form of a conventional attack. This also includes situations where Russia's ally Belarus is attacked, or if a non-nuclear power, with support from a nuclear-armed state, engages in acts of war against Russia. Essentially, any attack by a NATO member or a joint attack involving NATO support could be deemed as an attack on Russia itself, thereby triggering the potential use of nuclear weapons. Of course, the timing of this decree is no coincidence. Putin wanted to make it clear that he views Biden's decision as a direct threat to Russia's security. The Kremlin has long warned that if NATO provided Ukraine with weapons capable of reaching Russian territory, it would consider NATO's involvement in the conflict as direct. In response, Russia wouldn't hesitate to escalate the situation. However, these repeated threats have always been just that: threats, empty words. This makes Putin's reaction just another desperate attempt to claw back some semblance of control over a situation that has increasingly slipped from his grasp. But unless nuclear weapons truly enter the game, Russia is, as it stands, finished. It's losing troops, equipment, and money at an unprecedented rate. Now, with the capability for long-range strikes in Ukrainian hands, it will also lose territory and infrastructure. In other words, it's truly game over. But what do you think? Is Russia truly done, or will it find a way to turn the tide? Will the West continue to provide the necessary support to Ukraine, or will the recent changes in the US leadership begin to fracture the coalition? Putin thought he could steamroll Ukraine and rebuild his empire. Instead, he's driving Russia straight into the ground. His military is falling apart, soldiers are ditching the fight, and his economy is on life support. In today's video, we're exposing just how badly Putin screwed up. From troops sabotaging their own missions to his crumbling empire, we're digging into the mess he's created. You don't want to miss how deep this disaster really goes, because while stories about collapsing Russian morale are nothing new, what's happening now is on a whole new level. Putin has created a meat grinder of a war, in which his key to success is to throw untold thousands of Russian soldiers at Ukrainian positions until he eventually overwhelms them. At best, that approach has experienced mixed success, with Russia slowly taking territory in the Donbas region of Ukraine while losing thousands of troops in the process, 643,750 of them, if the armed forces of Ukraine's figures are to be believed. That meat grinder approach has led to morale being a massive problem since at least 2023. In August of that year, Defense Post reported on comments made by SKYROCKET, who served as a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet army and apparently has connections with key Russian officials who have been deployed in Ukraine. Gulayev painted a picture of a brutal war in which Russian soldiers are ill-equipped as they're left in trenches for months on end. They watch their comrades die, knowing that their own deaths will likely not be too far behind, all in service of a leader who doesn't want to help them. The army despises Putin, Gulayev says, while pointing out that many of the Russian soldiers on the front lines are forced to buy body armor and other equipment with their own wages. Gulayev went on to point out that Russia also lacks reserves. We'll cover the manpower issue soon, which means that many of its soldiers are denied leave. That's assuming that leave would even be possible, claims the former Soviet colonel, as many have to sit in trenches for months without access to any vehicles capable of extracting them. He claims there have been incidents in which he's been asked to buy military jeeps by officials on the front lines because Russia's soldiers don't even have access to military ambulances to evacuate wounded soldiers. It all has a real demoralizing effect, claims Gulayev, who says that the anger that stems from this low morale has resulted in Russian soldiers sabotaging their own operations. Fast forward to 2024, and those morale issues have only worsened, leading to thousands of Russian soldiers deserting their posts. There have been numerous instances of these desertions, with one of the most recent coming in June 2024. With morale along frontline troops plummeting, Russia is losing up to 1,200 soldiers per day to fighting in the Donbas region of Ukraine. With the increasing death toll comes more desertions. We've also seen similar collapses of morale during Ukraine's Kursk invasion. A September 2024 report in The Guardian claims that seized papers show that Russia anticipated an incursion into Kursk several months in advance of it happening. Did Putin reinforce Kursk's defenses once he had that information? Of course he didn't. He was too focused on the meat grinder in the Donbas. The result was hundreds of Russian soldiers stationed in Kursk surrendering without putting up a fight. Ukraine claimed to have seized 594 prisoners of war in the first 3 weeks of the incursion. Putin is following an unsustainable strategy in which he simply throws soldiers at Ukraine to try and win through manpower alone. But in doing that, he's failing to properly equip those soldiers, and he's left them in situations that result in rapidly declining morale and large-scale desertions. Hardly ideal for Russian commanders trying to organize operations. Let's hone in on this equipment problem. Beyond Russia's failure to provide the basics, such as body armor, to its soldiers, its military faces a far more damaging problem in terms of the larger military equipment it's been using to fight the war. Tanks and artillery have been pivotal to the Russian strategy, with much of Putin's success stemming from the fact that Russia has more of each than Ukraine. Or perhaps that should be had rather than has. It's no secret that Russia has been relying on Soviet-era tanks and artillery to maintain pressure on Ukraine's defenses. The T-80 tanks that have made up the majority of its tank offensives were first built in 1976, albeit with upgrades in the years that followed, and some of the tanks Russia has used against Ukraine date back to World War II. That was fine, even if it showcased the Russian military's lack of modern equipment, because Putin had vast reserves of these old pieces of equipment to call upon. Those reserves are rapidly running out. In an April 2024 article for Forbes, military analyst David Axe made the bold claim that Russia only has a 1-year reserve of weapons before it'll run out and be forced to withdraw from Ukraine. ATACMS points out that superior Ukrainian tactics have led to Russia losing far more than Ukraine despite its many military advantages. Those losses include 15,300 tanks, armored fighting vehicles and howitzers, along with other weapons, 3 times the losses Ukraine has suffered. Those losses aren't sustainable. Even with Russia's war production machine churning, the country only produces between 500 and 600 new tanks annually, with little more than 1,000 fighting vehicles at the same time. Given that Russia is losing well over 1,000 tanks per year, along with close to 2,000 vehicles, production isn't keeping up with the losses. That's why Russia relies so heavily on its Soviet-era stockpiles. The problem for Putin is that those stockpiles are finite. There's only so much old equipment he can pull out of mothballs. And as of July 2024, those stockpiles may be about to finally run out. That's according to Pravda, which says that Russia has been attempting to mask its low stockpiles with boasts of new deliveries. These boasts include mentions of receiving 1,530 tanks throughout 2023 from Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. What Shoigu didn't mention is that 85% of those tanks were ancient T-72s, T-62s, and T-55s. Those tanks, despite being slightly upgraded, are rapidly being destroyed, and there aren't many more left for Russia to use. Artillery is also a problem, claims Pravda. Russia has plenty of shells, with 3 million in stock thanks to its ties with North Korea. But having 3 million shells means little if the artillery firing them is wearing out. That's precisely what's happening. Russia is already putting old artillery barrels from its Soviet-era systems to use for newer artillery. It's done this 4,800 times already, with only 7,000 barrels remaining. Worse yet for Putin, these older barrels have already experienced wear and tear, in addition to poor storage conditions, meaning they wear out faster than a brand new barrel would. A critical point of exhaustion is coming for Russia's tanks and artillery. Both Forbes and Pravda claim that the milestone will arrive at some point during the second half of 2025. Those rapidly approaching shortfalls are the main reason why Russia is going to find itself increasingly relying on overseas equipment to continue its fight against Ukraine. That's according to the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, which reiterates the point that Russia has relied on its Soviet-era stockpiles to maintain the meat grinder Putin has created. Further mobilization of the country's defense industry is coming, claims ISW, but it's not going to be enough to replace what Russia has already lost. So an increasing reliance on overseas allies will soon become a hallmark of Russia's approach. ISW notes that North Korean artillery ammunition deliveries to Russia have a direct and rapid effect on the war's dynamics, with each delivery spurring renewed assaults against Ukrainian positions. As of June 2024, it says, North Korea has delivered 4.8 million artillery shells to Russia, demonstrating just how much Russia's production capacity has fallen off due to a combination of issues that include Western sanctions and a lack of labor. Russia is also trying to create similar relationships with Iran and China, turning them into suppliers for its war machine. That may seem fine on the surface, but think about what this means for Russia's military. The need to purchase weapons from other countries means Russia is a far cry from the nation that was once one of the world's largest arms suppliers. Russia's arms exports have plummeted since the beginning of the Ukraine war, transforming one of the country's booming businesses and a major contributor to its economy into a sector that can charitably be defined as faltering. Defense News made this clear in May 2024. It notes that the sales of Russian weapons to other countries between 2019 and 23 are down 53% on the sales achieved between 2014 and 18. Even within that 2019 to 23 period, Russia's weapons industry has been hit hard by sanctions and a simple lack of appetite from nations that don't want to support Putin's special military operation. In 2019, Russia had 31 countries as customers for the weapons it produces. By 2023, that number had fallen to just 12. And of those 12, sales to the likes of India, Egypt, and China have all declined. India is now spending 34% less on Russian weapons than it did between 2014 and 18, with Egypt also spending 54% less. It all adds up to a Russian military that's not only unable to produce at a high enough capacity to provide for itself, but it's also losing the ability to sell the weapons it creates to others. The new weapons are all going into fighting Ukraine, taking a massive bite out of an industry that was a significant contributor to Russia's gross domestic product, or GDP, before the war began. And that brings us to another reason why Russia's military is on the verge of collapse. It has a major manpower problem. Earlier we talked about low morale and desertion playing a role in the collapse. Neither of those problems is going to disappear when Putin is relying on mobilization and the issuing of what some in Russia are calling illegal orders for the country's men to go to war. Putin has already issued one mobilization order through which he essentially conscripted thousands of Russians to go into a war for which many don't have an appetite. In the run-up to the 2024 Russian presidential elections, he did everything he could to avoid a second mobilization, preferring instead to try to buy blood instead of mobilization, according to Tufts University military expert Pavel Lutzin. Dara Masicot of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace agrees with this analysis, claiming that the Kremlin would prefer to offer large sums of money for volunteers, raid the Russian prison system, restaurants, or other gatherings for manpower, ahead of implementing another round of mobilization. Remember that this is a country that's losing up to 1,200 soldiers per day and has already lost a total of more than 640,000 in Ukraine. And as of August 2024, Putin has doubled contract payments to the soldiers he's trying to draw into his military, meaning his special military operation is costing Russia's economy more and more with each passing month. It's an unsustainable system, with Putin constantly shelling out to keep the war running while attempting to avoid a round of mobilization that seems inevitable simply because the money is eventually going to run out. Russia may not be running out of soldiers it can send to the front on the surface, but it's long since run out of soldiers who actually want to be there, meaning those heading to the front lines are poorly trained and even more likely to desert than those who came before them. Russia is simply running out of manpower. And that leads us nicely into the economic collapse that's coming to the country. Much of that collapse is going to occur because Russia is fast running out of the workers it needs to keep its war industry churning and, crucially, to get the country back on a sound economic footing once the war is over. Euronews highlighted this in an August 2024 article in which it claimed that Russia's entire economy finds itself dealing with a precarious position in which it's trying to balance its need for labor with the military manpower Putin requires to feed into his meat grinder. The article highlights the direct economic impact of Putin's decision to provide payments to relatives of dead soldiers while focusing on hiring contract soldiers. In payments alone, Russia spent $33.3 billion between June 2023 and June 2024, an amount Euronews says is equivalent to 1.5% of the country's GDP. Throw in the increase in the lump sum being offered to contract soldiers to join the war, increasing to over $17,700 without accounting for the regular pay that follows, and you have a clear drain on the nation's economy. But far more worrying for Russia is the drain on manpower and long-term impact that it's going to have on Russia. International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn research fellow Ivan Klisic points out that Russia's military is now directly competing with the country's other industries to attract people. This creates a dilemma for Russia. State interests are conflicting. University College London professor Mark Kuldkep summarizes the problem, stating that Russia's military had to compete with Russian employers in strategically important sectors. This creates not just competition over pay, but also dilemmas of which state interests to prioritize, he says. The run-on effect of these manpower issues is that Russia is running the risk of shortages within its civilian economy. That civilian sector is also being forced to increase wages to appear more attractive than a military career, which, given that so much of that sector is wrapped up in the Russian state, will ultimately lead to the country itself being more out of pocket. These rapidly rising wages will also fuel inflation, making the cost of living in Russia higher than it's ever been, and potentially forcing interest rate hikes that will prevent regular citizens from borrowing money. It's like a row of dominoes just waiting to cascade. Putin is well aware of the problem. December 2023 brought with it the news that Russia is already short some 4.8 million workers, with that problem only going to get worse as more men are lured into the military with promises of high contract pay. By June 2024, Putin was forced to acknowledge this growing problem, though he tried to spin the numbers by claiming that the shortages were a result of Russia's record-low unemployment rate rather than anything to do with his war. Still, he had to admit that the lack of labor limits economic growth in an address on the Kremlin website, though he also proposed a solution to the problem: attracting qualified migrants from abroad. That solution seems to heavily involve North Korea, with which Russia has signed a cooperative defense pact in the summer of 2024. Several sources, including Daily NK and The Diplomat, say that North Korea is sending more and more laborers to Russia to help with its manpower crisis. The latter says that 150 North Koreans found themselves transported to the Donbas region of Ukraine in January 2024 alone, with more flying into Vladivostok by the month. As for Daily NK, it claims that North Korea's Central Committee has ordered the country's Workers' Party to prioritize recruiting workers to send overseas. There's a problem with this approach, and it's the same one that we see with Russia becoming increasingly reliant on North Korea for its artillery shells and other military equipment. Putin is burrowing himself deeper into North Korea's pocket. The Russian president keeps calling in favors, which means he's going to have to repay those favors at some point in the future. Maybe Putin realizes that, which is why his health minister is telling Russians to have more sex during work breaks, so he can tackle the country's declining birth rate and lack of labor manpower. If labor shortages are the problem, Putin is quite literally telling his people to pump up the numbers. Putin also claims he's intent on supporting the aspirations of Russians who've reached retirement age to keep on working. In other words, stop retiring and fill in the gaps my unsuccessful war has created. These manpower issues are pushing Russia closer to the brink of economic collapse. That may seem like a strange claim to make, seeing as Russia has a growing economy. The International Monetary Fund suggests the country will record economic growth of 3.2% by the end of 2024, propped up by a militaristic industrial sector that has grown to support the war. But what these seemingly positive figures hide is the fact that a huge amount of Russia's economy relies on keeping the war going, with so little being done to ensure this growth or even stability will continue in the long term. Looking to the future, Putin's special military operation has also created major issues for another of its major economic drivers, its energy sector. According to the Ukrainian World Congress, or UWR, approximately 90% of Russia's oil imports go through the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. That could present a problem for Putin, as Russia doesn't control the exits to either of these seas. The Black Sea is essentially controlled by Turkey, which has already prevented Russia from reinforcing its Black Sea fleet with new ships following Ukraine successfully destroying about a third of that fleet. As for the Baltic Sea, transit exits are overseen by Denmark. Turkey and Denmark are NATO members, with economist Yuri Gorodnichenko arguing that if either gains the political will to prevent Russia from exporting its oil through the Baltic and Black Seas, Russia will end very quickly. He has a point. Russia's combined coal, gas, liquid natural gas, and oil sales were over $1 billion per day during the first half of 2022. Then Western sanctions hit, which included many of Ukraine's supporters refusing to buy from the country or only doing so at massively reduced prices, and those sales have declined ever since. In August 2024, Russia's daily sales were at $706.91 million per day, with that figure also representing an 8% decline from the month prior. Losing $300 million per day is going to have an effect on any country. For Russia, it amounts to a $109.5 billion shortfall in energy sales, which is billions of dollars that can no longer go toward fueling its war effort or propping up its faltering economy. The problem for Putin is that Russia's war machine is being funded by its energy sales. As CEPA points out, Russia is likely going to spend 6% of its GDP on its military in 2024 alone. When combined with state disbursements for other war-related items, which includes things like construction within the territories Russia occupies in Ukraine, Russia will have spent $401 billion on the war in Ukraine in 2024. That's a 26.2% increase on the amount it spent in 2023, highlighting just how vital the war has become to Russia's economy. Putin needs to keep the war going to see any sort of return from the massive amounts he's pumping into manufacturing weapons. And he's also going to have to raise taxes and watch his country buckle under the weight of 8% inflation and a 16% base rate of interest as he does. Those energy sales also play a large role in keeping Russia's National Wealth Fund, or NWF, liquid. Therein lies another economic problem caused by Putin's war. The NWF has fallen by about $58 billion since February 2022, leaving just $55 billion available. That fund, which Putin has increasingly relied upon to fund the massive contracts he's handing out to soldiers, is quickly running out. Combine that with lower energy market sales, and you get a recipe for an oil and gas-reliant country to fall into a steep economic decline once the war ends. That decline may even come during the war. If it lasts for another 2 years, sanctions will only intensify, and Russia will deplete the NWF entirely. The simple fact is that Russia is edging towards an economic crisis as severe as its military crisis. It's spending too much on the war, not making enough money back to cover those costs, and facing a labor shortage so severe that Putin is having to officially encourage the Russian people to have more children. These massive military and economic challenges are reason enough for Russia being on the brink of collapse. But for Putin himself, they represent something far more dangerous: the constant erosion of his power base at home. Putin, like so many Russian leaders before him, maintains power by positioning himself as the strongman of Russian politics. He's the leader who can get things done, a man who will make Russia more powerful than it's ever been before. This image is so important to Putin in a political sense that losing even a small portion of it chips away at the very foundation of his power. If Russia doesn't see Putin as the strongman, he faces political collapse. And right now, Putin looks anything but strong. His military has proven to be something of a paper tiger, with Russia having fallen from one of the most feared nations in the world to one that isn't capable of defeating a much smaller country. Every Russian soldier who dies on the battlefield is a small shot to Putin's image as the strongman. Worse yet for Putin, several major events during the war have tarnished his reputation even further. The military group Wagner marching 5,000 of its soldiers toward Moscow was a warning. Granted, that mutiny didn't last long, and Putin quickly took care of Wagner's leader in the aftermath, but it showed that Putin wasn't immune to challenges. Far more damaging to Putin is the Kursk invasion, through which Ukraine has managed to take control of at least 92 settlements in the Russian oblast, along with holding 450 square miles of territory. It's the largest invasion launched on Russian soil since World War II, and it all happened on Putin's watch. The message Kursk sends to the Russian people is clear: Putin can't protect you. The fact that the invasion began in early August and Putin has still done very little about it only reinforces that message. The strongman of Russian politics is standing by helplessly as more of his country is overrun by an enemy that should have been too weak to stop him. Putin's glaring personal weaknesses are also being reflected by the Kremlin. A week after the Kursk invasion began, the ISW published an article in which it highlighted key Russian political weaknesses that can all be traced back to Putin. It says that Russia, though capable of adaptation over time, isn't able to pivot quickly because Putin is so risk-averse. Russia's leader taking several months to adapt to his initial failure to take Ukraine is an example of this, as is Putin's partial mobilization in September 2022. At that time, by only mobilizing a small portion of Russia, Putin cut himself off at the knees for future mobilization efforts, as evidenced by his hesitancy to announce a second round of mobilization in 2024. Russia's formation of partnerships with the likes of North Korea and China also presents long-term problems. There's a give and take to these types of arrangements, with every country that's supporting Russia likely to come calling for repayment of the favors later. Given that Russia is in such a weakened state already, with further weakening likely as the Ukraine war goes on, there's a good chance that the country will become beholden to others, even if it manages to win the Ukraine war. The Russian people will recognize this. That's why they're slowly, albeit not publicly, turning against him and the political structure he's created. Political apathy reigns supreme in Russia right now, with foreign policy claiming that many in the country expect Russia to receive nothing from Putin's war and, perhaps more importantly, don't even seem to care about that fact. Many Russians simply want their people to come back home, as a poll conducted by Chronicles revealed in September 2024. So dented is the Russian people's collective belief in their leader that 49% now back a complete withdrawal of troops, followed by peace talks with Ukraine. That's a 9% increase over the 40% of Russians who said the same in January 2024, and it shows that the Kursk invasion has shaken Russia's belief in Putin as a man who can protect them. That loss of public confidence may be more damaging to Putin than anything else. He's already overseen a war that's cost Russia hundreds of thousands of people while depleting its military stockpiles. Putin has allowed Russia to loosen its position as one of the world's top arms manufacturers, spent heavily out of Russia's national reserves, and allowed the country's energy industry to lose hundreds of billions of dollars per year. Russia has a manpower crisis so enormous that Putin is willingly putting Russia under the thumb of other countries to solve his people problem. And through it all, he's allowed the biggest invasion into Russia since World War II and has proven that he, his political allies, and the military he has long used to threaten the rest of the world are far weaker than anybody ever anticipated. The Russian military, economic, and political collapses are coming. The question now is, will those collapses take Putin and his cronies with them? Let's be clear, Ukraine would not exist as a country today without US support. Mark Rutte made this statement during his first press conference as incoming NATO Secretary General on October 1, 2024, and the former Dutch Prime Minister certainly has a point. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the US has provided at least $80 billion in military and other aid to Ukraine, with the latest package worth $8 billion announced during Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to New York in late September 2024. This aid, including everything from ammunition to M1 Abrams tanks and advanced missile systems like HIMARS and ATACMS, has not only undoubtedly enabled Ukraine to mount a stubborn, effective resistance, but to strike back. Of course, the US is far from the only nation to have provided sovereignty-preserving military aid to Ukraine, and it's one of NATO's smaller members, the Netherlands, that has just delivered arguably one of the most devastating blows to the Russian war effort to date. Russian President Vladimir Putin is not impressed, to say the least. So what exactly has the Netherlands done? Why could this mark a turning point in the war, and why is Putin so upset? All will be revealed in the video, but first, why is the Netherlands such a staunch supporter of Ukraine and an equally staunch opponent of Russia? This certainly wasn't always the case. As recently as 2016, Dutch citizens voted in a referendum against ratifying the EU's association agreement with Ukraine. However, research has shown that this against vote had very little to do with the feelings of the Dutch towards Ukraine itself. Some were concerned about a possible influx of cheap Ukrainian workers disrupting the local labour market, but their concerns were much more a reflection of dissatisfaction with the Dutch government at the time, led for 11 years until 2024 by the aforementioned Rutte. Dissatisfaction with what they perceived as increasing overreach by Brussels and resistance to European integration and EU expansion in general were also key factors in the vote. Many, particularly from the extreme right and left parties, were also concerned about provoking Putin, who had objected strongly to the idea of Ukraine joining the EU since the idea was first floated. Russia's invasion of Ukraine certainly shook things up in terms of Dutch sentiment toward both Ukraine and Putin. In research published by Bruegel in July 2023, 53% of Dutch citizens supported sanctions against Russia, even if this meant a higher cost of living for themselves. Only around a third felt that the most important thing was to reach a peace deal as quickly as possible, even if that meant Ukraine having to surrender some or all of the territories annexed by Russia in the Donbass, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Crimea. And in a January 2024 survey by Dutch newspaper RTL News, although 62% of those surveyed expressed worry that Russia might attack the Netherlands, their main concern seemed to be getting prepared, not backing down from Ukrainian support to appease Putin. Is this a case of Dutch courage? After all, Russia dwarfs the Netherlands in terms of size, spending power, population, and military strength, and on May 28, 2024, Putin directly threatened the Netherlands and other smaller European nations like the Baltic states over their provision of increasingly lethal military aid to Ukraine. In Europe, especially in small countries, they should realize what they're playing with. They should remember that they are countries with small, densely populated territories, he said. And he's not the only Russian politician to issue threats. On June 5, 2024, Alexei Zaravlyov, a member of the State Duma, Russia's lowest house of parliament, directly threatened the Netherlands on primetime Russian TV. If NATO threatens our country, then we will target countries that provide NATO with the infrastructure. The Netherlands, where the NATO facilities are located, will be among the primary targets, he said, adding, "This is called a nice target in the military, and this is a matter of one day with minimal consumption of nuclear ammunition." It's fair to say that to date all such Russian threats have been more or less bluster. However, were Russia to follow through on them, it wouldn't be the first time Russian forces attacked the Netherlands. Back in 1799, during the War of the Second Coalition, an expeditionary force of British and Russian troops invaded the North Holland Peninsula in the Batavian Republic. In some respects, this invasion, which ended with Anglo-Russian withdrawal, shares some striking similarities to Russia's invasion of Ukraine today. Although the Russian forces were more or less hired by the British, their organization, discipline, and performance in the field left somewhat to be desired, contributing to the eventual retreat of the British. The British were actually led at the time by the exiled Dutch Prince William of Orange, who was expecting the Dutch to welcome his invasion with open arms. Instead, to his dismay, he encountered stiff resistance and innovative tactics, such as flooding the canals, which forced the Anglo-Russian forces to retreat. Putin made exactly the same mistake in the early days of the current war. The Russians advanced on Kyiv expecting the local population to be standing by the side of the highway waving Russian flags, as when Hitler rolled into Vienna 75 years earlier. Instead, he was welcomed with dogged resistance and innovative urban warfare, forcing his 40-mile-long convoy of armored vehicles to turn tail from outside Kyiv and head hastily back to the Donbass. However, besides this incident, known as the Anglo-Russian invasion of Holland, Russian-Dutch relations had for the most part been excellent, from Tsar Peter the Great's initial visits to the Netherlands in the 17th century until the onset of the Soviet Union. In fact, Dutch shipbuilders, brought back to Russia by Peter, more or less built the early Russian navy, and in the early 1800s, the Russians and Dutch fought together in the alliance against Napoleon. In more recent times, although Russian-Dutch relations have soured considerably over the past decade, they had been pretty healthy after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. In 2011, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev met with Prime Minister Rutte in the Kremlin to discuss bilateral ties. Dutchmen Guus Hiddink and Dick Advocaat managed the Russian football team from 2006 to 12, and at the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi, Russia, Putin and Dutch King Willem Alexander clinked glasses and enjoyed a round of fine Dutch ale at the Holland Heineken beer house. In fact, 2013 was designated the Year of Russia in the Netherlands. It was supposed to be a celebration of 400 years of bilateral relations, and Putin actually visited Amsterdam on a state visit. But by the end of the year, relations had taken a significant turn for the worse. The trouble started when Russia arrested Greenpeace protesters aboard a Dutch-registered vessel in the Arctic, leading to a diplomatic spat. The arrest of Russian Embassy Minister Councillor Dmitry Borodin on charges of abusing his children followed a week later by Dutch diplomat Onno Elderenbosch being physically attacked in his apartment in Moscow, only worsened the mood. The spat upgraded from a diplomatic row to an economic one in March 2014, when the Netherlands participated in EU sanctions against Russia for its role in the civil war in Ukraine. Russia retaliated in August of that year with agricultural sanctions against the EU, including the Netherlands, who produce almost a quarter of the world's agricultural output. But it was the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 over the Donbass in July 2014 that caused relations to reach their lowest point in centuries. A total of 193 Dutch nationals lost their lives on that plane. The Dutch blamed Russia, a claim that Russia has vehemently denied. But in any event, the net result was that by the time the Russian invasion of February 22 rolled around, and the Western world began imposing sanctions on Russia and supplying aid to Ukraine, it was a safe bet that the Netherlands would be one of the first to join in. And just as safe a bet that the Netherlands would be one of the first names on Russia's list of unfriendly nations too. In terms of support for Ukraine, the Dutch have certainly put their money where their mouth is, over $7.25 billion already, with another $4 billion committed until the end of 2026. So what kind of support has the Netherlands provided, and why is the latest round so important? We'll answer that second, juicy part of the question shortly. But first, let's unpack the aid that the Dutch have provided already, going from the least lethal to the most. The biggest, most powerful weapons deservedly get the headlines, but there's much more to waging war than that. And in the case of the Netherlands, it's really quite staggering to see just how comprehensive their assistance has been. As of June 5, 2024, the Netherlands has officially supplied a veritable mountain of clothing, helmets, shrapnel vests, rations and medical supplies, including personal first aid kits and medicines, over 10,000 tents, 4,400 computer and data systems, 33 field hospitals, and 31 mobile field kitchens have also been supplied. To assist with logistics and engineering, they provided 25 cranes, 21 trucks with side loadings, 20 mechanical shovels, 29 forklift side loader combinations, 6 flat track cranes, 22 trailers, and 6,600 field reinforcements. With so much of the front line spanning rivers, estuaries, and wetlands, both the Ukrainians and Russians have regularly targeted bridges to disrupt enemy logistics. So the 37 Bailey bridges, 6 M3 pontoon systems, and 5 Leopard 1 bridge-laying tanks, with bridges supplied by the Netherlands, have undoubtedly come in extremely handy for the Armed Forces of Ukraine, or AFU. So of the assortment of 1,320 vehicles comprising 4-ton trucks, tractor-trailer combinations, Amarak vehicles, ambulances, fuel transport trucks, MB all-terrain vehicles, motorcycles and quads, state-of-the-art demining equipment has also been generously provided, including 1 Scanjack mine clearance rig, 3 Bozina mine clearance rigs, 9 mine plows, 6 mine rollers for BMP infantry combat vehicles, 2 Alkmaar-class naval mine hunters, plus a variety of mine detectors, mine picks, and EOD equipment. In terms of sensors and sensing devices, 557 assorted drones, 4 Vera-NG passive radar systems, plus ground sensors and night vision equipment, including brightness intensifiers and thermal imagers, have been delivered to the AFU. Moving on to firepower, individual weapons provided include MAG, Mini-Me, and 50 caliber machine guns, long and medium-range rifles such as the HK416, and pistols. For fire support, 8 PZH-2000 armored howitzers, and an undisclosed quantity of M109 howitzers and 120mm mortars have been supplied. Needless to say, weapons are much more effective when they're loaded with ammunition. Copious amounts have been provided, including various types of small caliber ammunition for individual weapons, heavy ammunition for combat vehicles, tank and helicopter gun systems, anti-tank ammunition such as Law and Panzerfaust, 155mm artillery ammunition, plus rifle grenades, non-lethal hand grenades, and other explosives. Speaking of combat vehicles and tanks, these deliveries have been among the most high-profile, telling, and infuriating for Putin. He probably wasn't too concerned about the arrival of the Fennec reconnaissance vehicles and Viking tracked vehicles, but no doubt the arrival of 60 T-72 tanks and more recently 269 YPR armored tracked vehicles pleased him less. However, the cherry on top was surely the arrival of at least 100 Leopard 1 and 14 Leopard 2A4 tanks, jointly supplied by Germany and Denmark. These vehicles and tanks have undoubtedly made a difference on the battlefield, allowing the AFU to wage a protracted land-based war of attrition against a larger force for far longer than Putin was expecting. But it's in the air that the Dutch military support for Ukraine has had the most profound effect. going a long way to neutralize Russia's superiority in that theater of the war. In terms of air defense, the Dutch have supplied 2 Patriot launchers along with Patriot air defense missiles, 100 MR2 mobile anti-aircraft guns, 20 Bofors 40L70 40mm anti-aircraft guns, 4 Vera-NG systems, and assorted missiles and missile systems for air defense and drone control, such as the Stinger. Under the category of air offense, we arrive at the most important, controversial, and possibly game-changing military aid yet: 42 F-16 fighter aircraft. F-16s can fly up to twice the speed of sound and have a maximum range of more than 2,000 miles. They can also fire modern weapons used by NATO countries, a critical point, as we'll see shortly. Of the 42 F-16s supplied by the Netherlands, 24 are destined for Ukraine for military use, with the remaining 18 going to Romania, where they'll be used to train Ukrainian pilots. On September 28, 2024, footage of 4 F-16 fighters leaving the Netherlands bound for Ukraine started appearing online. Although it's unknown exactly how many of the F-16s promised to Ukraine by the Dutch have already been delivered, these latest additions join at least another 6 that are known to have been delivered in early August 2024. Although Zelensky has stated that he needs at least 300 F-16s to mount a truly effective air defense and offense against Russia, these latest deliveries are undoubtedly a major boost for Ukraine. With a bit of luck, they'll last a bit longer than the first confirmed loss, which crashed on August 26, 2024. The reasons for the crash are still unclear, with a Defense Ministry inquiry underway. A heavy Russian aerial attack involving 5 missiles and 74 Shahid drones was underway at the time of the crash, according to the Ukrainian Air Force. But there were also reports that it was shot down by friendly fire from a Patriot missile. On September 26, 2024, Russian military channels reported that a Russian hypersonic Kinzhal missile strike had destroyed 4 F-16s on the ground at Strakon-Stantinov airfield in western Ukraine. The Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation immediately denied it. Russian sources, including propagandist Anatoly Shary, are spreading information about the supposed loss of 4 F-16 fighter jets during today's unexpected missile strike. This information is presented without any evidence or concrete facts. Such reports are yet another fake designed to manipulate public opinion, fabricated to push the narrative of the ineffectiveness of Western aircraft, their statement on Telegram read, without providing any evidence or concrete facts themselves. Such is the fog of war. But assuming that Ukraine still has the full quota of either 9 or 23 F-16s at its disposal, how can these few planes make a difference in the war? They're 45 years old after all, and in truth have been decommissioned and mothballed by the Dutch, who are in the process of upgrading to the state-of-the-art F-35. The answer in a nutshell: long-range strikes deep inside Russia. Ukraine's strikes inside Russia are becoming much more frequent, much more destructive, and are already a serious thorn in Putin's side. The Russian Defense Ministry issues daily reports of the shooting down of dozens, if not hundreds, of Ukrainian drones and missiles inside Russia, particularly in and around the city of Belgorod. But increasing numbers are getting through, and the damage and casualties are rising. Since the beginning of September 2024, there have been 6 major incidents. On September 1st, Ukraine launched over 100 drones against targets including the Konakovo power station in Konakovo, Tver Oblast, and the Moscow refinery in Moscow. Then on September 10th, Ukraine launched 144 drones against Moscow, the largest drone attack against Russia in the war. Russian authorities reported dozens of homes being damaged and 2 people killed by the attack. But the Ukrainians were just getting started. On September 18th, Ukraine launched a successful drone attack on the main Missile and Artillery Directorate, or GRAU, 107th Ammunition Depot in Toropets, causing a massive series of explosions and fires while damaging much of the town. NASA firm's satellites detected the resulting fires over an area of approximately 5 square miles, with the blast wave spread up to 200 miles. Russian officials reported that 13 people had been injured and that an evacuation of the area had been ordered, with the Estonian Defense Forces Intelligence Center estimating that the strike had caused 30,000 tons of munitions to explode. Then on the night of September 20th to 21st, 2024, Ukraine launched drone attacks on 2 Russian ammunition depots, the Grau 23rd Arsenal near the village of Oktyabarsky in Tver Oblast, and the 719th Artillery Ammunition Base near Tioretsk in Krasnodar Krai. Although fires and some damage were reported, the Russians claim the drones were all shot down and the damages and fires were caused by falling debris. Whether that's true or not, for the Russians, October certainly started with a bang. October 3rd particularly. In the early hours, Ukrainian drones struck the Borysoglebsk air base in the Voronezh Oblast, about 185 miles from Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast. targeting Su-34s and Su-35 jets, fuel tanks, and a warehouse for Russian glide bombs. While the extent of the damage is not yet clear, the NASA FIRMS satellite monitoring system detected several fire hotspots on the premises of the facility, supporting claims of a successful attack. Then, during the day, Russian sources reported the downing of 4 Ukrainian missiles attempting to attack the Kursk nuclear power plant, or NPP. The missiles were reportedly shot down just 3 miles from the NPP itself, causing a fire in the town of Kurchatov. This is not the first time the Russians have narrowly avoided direct Ukrainian hits on the Kursk NPP, and frankly, one has to question the sanity of attacking a nuclear power plant so close to Ukraine's borders. As Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova pointed out in late September, radiation doesn't stop at borders. Radiation doesn't need a visa. Or maybe the Ukrainians have forgotten what happened at Chernobyl. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant, just 60 miles from Kyiv, was Ukraine's first NPP, but is no longer operational. Ukraine still has 3 fully operational NPPs, however, with 15 nuclear reactors between them. They are the 3 gigawatt or GW South Ukraine nuclear power plant located in Yuzhno-Krainsk, the 3 GW Rivne nuclear power plant in Rivne, and the 2 GW Khmelnytsky nuclear power plant in Netyshin. Technically, the 6 GW Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, located in Energodar, is the 4th Ukrainian NPP, but it's been under Russian control since 2022 and regularly shelled by Ukraine too, if the Russians and staff are to be believed. These NPPs are critical for Ukraine's energy supply, particularly since Russia has been mercilessly hammering Ukraine's thermal power infrastructure for almost 2 years, starting as retaliation for Ukraine's successful attack on the Kerch Bridge in Crimea. These attacks, according to the Ukrainian authorities, have decimated 80% of Ukraine's power supply, leaving millions of people at risk of severe power cuts this coming winter. But so far, Russia has strictly avoided targeting the NPPs. Why would Ukraine risk provoking Russia into striking their NPPs by repeatedly trying to strike theirs? For sure, up until now, Putin has seemingly allowed Ukraine to step over one supposed red line after another, without any of the nuclear or other highly destructive retaliation he keeps threatening. But there's a very big difference between striking a nuclear reactor and striking an ammo depot or an airfield. However costly the damage inflicted on the targets Ukraine has been hitting might be, it doesn't have a half-life of thousands of highly radioactive years. Perhaps this is why, besides the Netherlands and Denmark, none of the nations that are supplying military aid to Ukraine have given permission to use their weapons to strike deep into Russia, yet. Maybe they simply don't trust Ukraine not to do something that might have devastating consequences for themselves. In late September, Putin responded to growing provocation and subsequent ridicule about his failure to follow through with major escalation in response to each red line being nonchalantly stepped over by Ukraine. He ordered Russia's nuclear doctrine to be updated. In a nutshell, the update means that if Russia is attacked, even with missiles that contain conventional weapons but are able to contain nuclear warheads, Russia could respond with a nuclear attack. And not just against the country firing the missile, but against the countries that supplied and facilitated it too. Perhaps he's bluffing again, or perhaps it's just a matter of time until the red haze comes over him and he reaches for the big red button. Certainly, subsequent public statements from the US and the UK expressing hesitation about allowing Ukraine to strike deeper within Russia using its weapons suggest that, at least publicly, they've taken him seriously. Or perhaps the reticence to give permission is more a question of domestic politics. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been adamant about not allowing the use of Taurus missiles supplied to Ukraine for strikes inside Russia. His party, the Social Democratic Party or SPD, is losing ground rapidly to both the right-wing Alternative for Germany, locally known as the AfD, and left-wing Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, Reason and Justice, both of whom strongly oppose further military aid to Ukraine. He doesn't want to risk pushing more voters into their hands. French politics is a bit of a circus at the moment, to put it mildly. A wide coalition of left and extreme left-leaning parties colluded in the second round of general elections to keep out the far right, who had won the first round. President Emmanuel Macron now seems to have colluded with the right, but not the far right, to diminish the power of the victorious left in the new cabinet. The left is furious, as are the far right. It's a political powder keg, which could easily be ignited as a result of France being dragged into direct involvement in Ukraine, or worse, subject to attack by Russia. According to the Russians, fragments of the downed missiles in the October 3rd attack on the Kursk NPP indicate they were French-supplied scalps. And scalp missiles are capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. France has 58 nuclear reactors at 18 sites, almost all of which are within the 1,865-mile range of the Kh-47M2 Kinzhal. The UK's political situation is only marginally more stable than that in France. Sir Keir Starmer, their fourth prime minister in as many years, is grappling with right-wing anti-immigration riots. discord within his own party over military support for Israel, and increasing discontent over the ever-rising cost of living. Both he and his Defense Secretary David Lammy have spoken aggressively in favor of Ukraine, with Lammy likening Putin to a slave owner trying to turn a mafia state into a mafia empire, in a fiery speech at the UN on September 25, 2024. But besides the French Scalps, the British Storm Shadows are the only other missile provided to Ukraine so far that's capable of holding a nuclear warhead. The Storm Shadow is a precision-guided air-launched cruise missile with a range of over 185 miles, costing around $1 million a pop. It uses INS, GPS, and terrain reference navigation, making it capable of attacking hardened or buried targets. And Ukraine has been using Storm Shadows prodigiously to attack Russian targets since deliveries started arriving in 2023. In particular, Storm Shadows have been used to target Russian naval assets such as the Rostov-on-Don submarine and Minsk landing ship in Sevastopol. With the recent polarizing US election, the last thing the US needs is a major escalation of the war its ally is already embroiled in. They already have Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's belligerence to deal with. And hot wars and elections are generally not a good mix at the best of times. Unless you're Putin, if the most recent Russian election results are anything to go by. Republican President-elect Donald Trump has made it clear that his approach to the Ukraine war will not be the same as the kind of support that the Biden administration has delivered. With Kamala Harris out of the picture, Israel can certainly count on Trump's support, but what the US does in regards to Ukraine remains to be seen. Compared to all of the above, the political situation in both the Netherlands and Denmark is decidedly sane and stable. Perhaps that's part of the reason these nations have been the first to unequivocally grant permission to Ukraine to use their weapons to strike as deep inside Russia as Ukraine deems necessary. The Danes had already granted permission for Ukraine to use the 19 F-16s they are supplying for strikes inside Russia back in May. In August, Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen went even further. Defending yourself may well include invading the aggressor's territory. If, as part of this, you attack the infrastructure or military facilities of the attacking party, this is fully in line with the rules of war, he said. And on September 24, 2024, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen urged others to follow their example. Let's end the discussion about red lines. Let's not delay what Ukrainians need to push Russia back. So far, only the Dutch have heeded the call and joined the Danes in supplying their F-16s. That gives Ukraine the capability to fire long-range missiles deep into Russia. As mentioned earlier, the F-16 supplied to Ukraine have been outfitted with the ability to fire modern, long-range, high-impact weapons. Ukraine now has the F-16s, but they'll still need the missiles. To that end, on top of all the other assistance detailed earlier in the video, on July 10, 2024, the Netherlands announced that it had allocated an additional €300 million, around $325 million, to purchase munitions for the F-16. As ground-based missiles, neither the ATACMS nor HIMARS missiles supplied in large quantities by the US can be fired from an F-16. So what long-range munitions capable of striking deep into Russia could those funds procure? The lowest hanging fruit in terms of availability and suitability would be the US-made AIM-120 family, which can carry a 44-pound warhead. The variant with the longest range is the AIM-120D, but at 86 to 97 miles, it's barely going to reach Kursk, let alone deep into Russia. While these missiles might well prove invaluable for use in defensive situations, shooting down Russian missiles and drones from way behind the front lines, in an offensive sense, they're a waste of money. Russia's reaction to Ukraine's successful drone attacks in the Russian oblasts bordering Ukraine has been to move attack aircraft and other expensive assets further back into the heartland, beyond the range of Storm Shadows, Scalps, and attack drones. What Ukraine really needs is a warehouse full of AGM-158 JASSMs. These air-launched US-made cruise missiles pack a 1,000-pound warhead that can be fired with an accuracy of within 10 feet. More importantly, their range is from 230 to 575 miles, depending on the model, and Moscow is only 280 miles from the border. At around $1 million each, that Dutch F-16 ammunition fund could procure the necessary warehouse full, provided that is, that the US is willing and able to part with them. Only somewhere between 2,000 and 7,200 units have ever been produced, with Lockheed Martin, the manufacturer, only able to produce 500 to 1,000 units annually. Thus far, the US has been unwilling to include JASSMs in any military aid package. To be fair, before the confirmed delivery of the Dutch and Danish F-16s, it made little sense. That's because their incompatibility with what remains of the Ukrainian Air Force's ex-Soviet jets means there will be nothing to fire them from. Now, those JASSMs could turn out to be the game changer, and with the US distracted by controversies surrounding the recent election, chaos in the Middle East, his Kursk invasion having stalled, and the Eastern Front collapsing, Zelensky and the AFU could certainly use a game changer about now. But whatever happens next, history suggests the Netherlands will always be in Ukraine's corner. Do you think the US will give Ukraine JASMs? If they do, what targets do you think would cause the most damage to Russia? President Joe Biden has just made a decision that will change the entire course of the Ukraine war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's much-vaunted victory plan required the United States to give the green light to a specific action that up until now, the US hasn't allowed. America giving the go-ahead for this one thing would allow Ukraine to obliterate Russia by taking the fight directly to some of Russia's most important strategic assets. The US has spent the last 2.5 years hemming and hawing over this decision, but finally, it's happened. President Joe Biden has given Ukraine permission to strike Russia inside Russian territory using US-made and supplied long-range missiles. It's the last major act of a president who will soon leave the White House, and it's going to change the course of the war. And it's an act that's already benefited Ukraine. A mere day after the reports of permission being granted filed in, Ukraine took action. It launched the first of what will likely be many ATACMS missiles at Russia. This is massive news. In this video, we're going to examine the reasons behind Biden's decision to give the green light for ATACMS usage inside Russia before examining how Ukraine intends to use its missiles to obliterate the Russian Federation. The BBC was among the first to report on President Biden's decision. On November 18th, it delivered the basics. Biden had given the green light for ATACMS use inside Russia, the outlet said, in a major policy reversal. Previously, the use of these missiles had been restricted to targets inside Ukraine and in Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, for fear that using them in Russia could escalate the war. CNN provides more details in its own report. It points out that the approval isn't official, in the sense that Biden's announced Ukraine's ability to use ATACMS missiles against Russia to the public. Rather, the news of the approval comes from a pair of US officials who are close to the president and familiar with the wrangling that's been going on surrounding ATACMS usage. One of those officials points out that the missiles are currently intended for use in Kursk in the wake of Russia's decision to deploy 50,000 troops to the oblast. Those 50,000 troops may include as many as 12,000 North Korean soldiers, which Putin has at his disposal thanks in large part to the cooperative defense pact he signed with North Korean President Kim Jong-un back in July 2024. Biden's advisors believe that the arrival of these troops could spark a new phase of the war, according to CNN. So the ATACMS approval delivers more firepower to the Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk at a time when they're coming under intense pressure. Al Jazeera's diplomatic correspondent James Bays backs this reasoning up. He says that the aim of these Western nations is to support Ukraine, particularly in the area of Russia that Ukraine has occupied, Kursk. Why does Kursk matter? In August 2024, Volodymyr Zelensky made the unexpected decision to play Putin at his own game. Rather than focusing merely on the defense of the beleaguered Donetsk region inside Ukraine, he sent a small contingent of the country's troops into Russia's Kursk Oblast. A red line was crossed. Ukraine entered Russia, and in a matter of weeks, Ukraine was claiming that it held over 450 square miles of Russian territory, including 93 villages, thanks to its counter-invasion. The Kursk invasion marked a turning point in the war, with Ukraine's capture of Russian territory giving it a major bargaining chip should negotiations ever start with Putin. Ukraine now has the option of trading what it holds in Kursk for some of the territory Russia has taken during Putin's special military operation. Of course, that bargaining chip goes away if Ukraine isn't able to keep the territory it has in Kursk. Putin's deployment of 50,000 soldiers in a counteroffensive is supposed to retake the many settlements Ukraine has claimed. Ukraine needs to fight against that counteroffensive, which is where the ATACMS missiles come into play. With them, Ukraine can launch strikes against Russian and North Korean positions in Kursk from within its own borders. That's huge for Ukraine. It's now able to support its soldiers on the ground with missile strikes that Russia can't easily counter. Back to CNN's report. It also notes that the approval of ATACMS use in Russia has been a long time coming. The US outright refused to send the missiles to Ukraine, even for use within its own territory, for the first 2 years of the war. Escalation of the war was the main fear at the time. The US was wary of what Putin might do in response to sending such powerful missiles to Ukraine. CNN also notes that some within the United States also worried about the US eating into stockpiles of ATACMS, essentially reducing its ability to defend itself in return for arming Ukraine. President Biden reversed that policy in February 2024, enabling the first ATACMS systems to enter Ukraine in April. But even then, the edict was clear. Ukraine was only to use the missiles to attack Russian positions within its own territory. Crimea could be included in that list, given that the US doesn't recognize Russia's 2014 annexation of the peninsula, meaning it should still be owned by Ukraine, but attacks on Russia itself were a no-go. President Zelensky had pressed long and often to get the go-ahead to use the missiles against Russia, even before the US allowed them to be used inside Ukraine. There were signs that the approval was on its way several months before it came. In September 2024, Al Jazeera reported on what it called a faint glimmer of hope for Ukraine after months of Zelensky's haranguing for permission to use ATACMS missiles against Russia. Biden responded, "We're working that out right now." When asked about lifting his geographic restrictions, the president's Secretary of State Antony Blinken also noted that the US has continuously adjusted and adapted based on battlefield conditions. The signs were there that approval was incoming. Putin's decision to use North Korean troops in his counteroffensive against the Ukrainian positions in Kursk appears to have pushed President Biden to make his decision. After all, Putin's use of North Korean soldiers represents the type of escalation the US always feared. Now it needs to help Ukraine counter that escalation with stronger weapons. Zelensky finally has what he's wanted for over 2 years, and Russia isn't happy. Putin has already made several threats against the US as it deliberated over whether to permit Ukraine to use ATACMS inside Russia. Toward the end of September 2024, less than 2 weeks after President Biden and Blinken's comments about considering ATACMS usage, Putin was on the warpath. It's proposed that aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear state, be considered as their joint attack on the Russian Federation. Putin raged during a September meeting of Russia's Security Council. The use of the word nuclear was very intentional. Putin was essentially saying that Russia would consider the US permitting Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles in Russia as an attack conducted by a nuclear nation. And even though those missiles won't carry nuclear warheads, Russia reserved the right to respond to such conventional missile strikes with nuclear weapons. In short, don't do it, America. We'll use nukes if you let Ukraine use your missiles against us. The Russian response has been no less muted now that President Biden has given his approval. Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, was one of the first to respond. If such a decision was really formulated and brought to the attention of the Kyiv regime, this is a qualitatively new round of tension and a qualitatively new situation in terms of the involvement of the United States in the conflict, he said when speaking to Russian media. Of course, Peskov's statements ignore the fact that Russia had already escalated with its decision to use North Korean troops against Ukraine in Kursk. But that hypocrisy has never stopped the Kremlin from making threats against the US before. Russian lawmaker Maria Butina also warned that President Biden's actions would lead to a massive escalation. However, she also pointed to Russia's hope that President-elect Donald Trump would overturn Biden's decision. "I have a great hope that Trump will overcome this decision if this has been made, because they are seriously risking the start of World War III," claimed Butina. Peskov has also made mention of the outgoing administration in Washington and its intention to add fuel to the fire in the war. So it appears Russia may be hoping that Donald Trump will come to their rescue and save the country from ATACMS missiles. Whether that will actually happen, President-elect Trump's proposed peace plan could prevent escalation, remains to be seen. It's also worth noting that President Biden's decision hasn't been met with universal approval from other nations in Europe. Hungary, Italy, and Slovakia have all condemned the decision, perhaps because they believe that using ATACMS missiles in Russia will escalate tensions to the point where other European countries are threatened. Politico also reports that one French military official says that permitting Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles will not change the balance of power in the war. It will merely slow down rather than stop what the official views as an industrial war, in which the nation that can produce the most weapons in the long run is the most likely to win. It's difficult to determine whether those comments amount to French disapproval of President Biden's decision or not. Still, it doesn't matter, the decision has been made. And perhaps it's President Zelensky who provides the most telling response to Biden's decision. Reacting to the news, he said, "Today there's a lot of talk in the media about us receiving permission for respective actions. But strikes are not carried out with words. Such things are not announced. Missiles will speak for themselves." The last statement is telling. Zelensky's suggesting that all of the talk is meaningless because Ukraine has the permission it needs. And with that, we come to a key question. Why is Russia so afraid of America's ATACMS missiles? We only need to look at the missile specs to find the answer. Al Jazeera provides some details about the ATACMS, or Army Tactical Missile System, in its report about Biden's decision. It says they were first developed in the 1980s, with the missiles having a 190-mile range that allows them to be launched from within Ukraine to strike Russian territory. They're built by Lockheed Martin and are launchable by both the HIMARS systems the US has sent to Ukraine in July 2022 and the M270 multiple launch rocket systems Ukraine received from the UK in the same year. In other words, Ukraine already has everything it needs to fire the ATACMS. It just needed permission to use them how it wanted. Missile Threat provides more details, noting that the ATACMS is a single-stage missile that can be loaded with a high explosive or blast fragmentation warhead, the latter of which packs up to 950 submunitions, allowing for powerful scattershot attacks against Russian positions. The mention of HIMARS in the M270 system should also clue you into the fact that the ATACMS is a road mobile missile that allows Ukraine to launch from almost anywhere within its territory. That's what will make it so useful for countering Russia's Kursk offensive. Ukraine can literally drive its ATACMS missiles to the border it shares with Russia and launch both into the territory it's taken and the positions that Russian and North Korean troops have established on Kursk's outskirts. The ATACMS is also designed for precision. 4 tail fins located on its rear keep it stable while it's in flight, with the nose cone at the front doing the same. The missile also combines GPS and an inertial navigation system, or INS, that allows it to fly directly to its intended target while minimizing collateral damage. The INS system also offers protection against interference and electronic jamming, meaning Russia will need to rely on its S-300 and S-400 anti-air systems to shoot it out of the skies. Given that the ATACMS can reach speeds of up to Mach 3, hitting it while it's in flight is a pretty tall order. In short, it's an extremely powerful missile, the likes of which Russia hasn't needed to contend with for much of the war. Outside of a handful of strikes in Crimea, with one taking place in June 2024 that killed at least 4 Russians and injured a further 151, Ukraine hasn't been able to get the most out of its ATACMS missiles. Now it can. And it's that fact that terrifies Putin. So we come to another question. What does Ukraine's new ability to use ATACMS missiles against Russia mean for the future of the war? It's all bad news for Russia. And Ukraine has already given us one of the answers. On November 19th, the BBC reported that US officials had confirmed that Ukraine has launched the first of its ATACMS missiles at Russia. The strike involved 5 missiles, all targeting the Bryansk region, according to Russia's defense ministry. Of those 5, 1 managed to make it through Russia's anti-air defenses, with fragments of the exploded missile causing a fire at a military facility in the border oblast. At least that's according to Russia. The US officials who confirmed the attack say that the numbers are much different. Ukraine actually fired 8 missiles, only 2 of which Russia managed to intercept. This suggests that 6 got through, likely causing far more damage than Russia would like to admit. Reuters followed up the BBC's report, noting that Ukraine is now claiming that it managed to strike a Russian arms depot located 70 miles deep into the Bryansk region. The attack was also accompanied by a drone strike, targeting at least 8 southern and central regions. Russia's defense ministry claims it shot down 42 of the drones, along with 4 of 5 ATACMS missiles. Whatever the truth may be, the Kremlin was quick to respond to the news. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov immediately accused the United States of escalating a conflict of which it shouldn't have any part. That ATACMS was used repeatedly overnight against the Bryansk region is of course a signal that they, meaning the United States, want escalation, Lavrov claimed. He then made the chilling claim that Russia would proceed with any future decisions from the understanding that Ukraine's ATACMS were operated by American military experts. And this attack may just be the start of Ukraine's ATACMS offensive. As mentioned earlier, Putin has amassed around 50,000 soldiers, including troops from North Korea, to drive out the Ukrainian occupiers in the Kursk Oblast. That counteroffensive is going poorly for Russia. On November 12th, Forbes military expert David Axe reported that Ukraine had already destroyed 77 Russian armored vehicles during the first 6 days of the counteroffensive. Most of those were along the northern edge of the territory Ukraine holds in the oblast. And to make matters worse for Putin, those reports came amidst others claiming that Ukraine had killed 1,950 Russian soldiers and destroyed over 100 armored vehicles in a single day across the entire 800-mile front line. The new voice of Ukraine says that Russia has resorted to flattening their own troops and killing their own citizens by essentially carpet-bombing the areas in Kursk that Ukraine holds. Russia has shelled the territory 11,578 times, the media outlet claims, in addition to dropping 3,243 guided aerial bombs and 356 unguided missiles onto Kursk. That's where Ukraine's ATACMS weapons come into play again. Russia can blanket Kursk with bombs from fortifications it's built outside the new front line Ukraine created when it invaded Kursk. Previously, there was little Ukraine could do about this, beyond holding its ground against the constant bombing. But with permission to use ATACMS inside Russia, comes the ability to target the airfields and launching locations Russia has used to attack Kursk so intently. With some of those locations destroyed, the Ukrainian troops on the ground can focus on defending themselves against the 50,000-strong counteroffensive, significantly raising their chances of holding Kursk for the long run. And it's not just bases near Kursk that Ukraine can attack. it has so many more potential targets to strike with ATACMS that would relieve pressure across the entire front line. In the wake of Biden's approval, the Kyiv Post noted that having access to ATACMS could allow Ukraine to strike over 245 military objects. These objects include 15 air bases, with some of the most prominent being in the Bryansk, Kursk, Lipetsk, Rostov, and Kaluga regions. It's a massive upgrade on the rockets Ukraine previously launched from their HIMARS, which could only travel 50 miles and hit 20 of the 245-plus potential targets ATACMS can reach. And Ukraine has already proven it can hit Bryansk with its November 19th strike. Back to the airfields. They matter because they're what Russia uses to launch its terrifying glide bombs, predominantly made using Russia's Soviet-era Fab 1500 bombs, which weigh about 1.65 tons. Glide bombs are made using a special upgrade kit that costs as little as $20,000. That kit essentially equips Russia's old bombs with wings, allowing its aircraft to launch them from behind the front lines so they can glide to targets in Ukraine. Russia has buffeted Ukraine with these bombs. March 2024 alone saw Russia send around 3,000 glide bombs Ukraine's way, and many more thousands have hit Ukraine since. As for why they're so dangerous, you only need to compare a glide bomb to a standard artillery shell. A Russian 152mm shell contains around 14 pounds of explosive. The country's 1.65-ton glide bomb packs an enormous 440 pounds of explosive into their massive shells, giving each bomb over 31 times the destructive power of an artillery shell. The one downside to glide bombs, from the Russian perspective, is that they need to be launched from the air. A plane has to take off, hit a suitable altitude, and position itself appropriately before launch. For that, Russia needs airfields from which these planes can take off, which brings us right back to the 15 airfields Ukraine can now target with its ATACMS. Taking just one of those airfields out drastically reduces Russia's ability to safely launch glide bombs from behind the front lines. Taking out several would massively relieve the intense pressure Russia has placed on Ukraine in its push to take Donetsk. Again, we'll see a similar result to what the ATACMS will achieve in Kursk. Less fire from above, allowing Ukrainian ground troops to counter Russia's offensive maneuvers on the ground. Beyond the airfields, you also have to consider what other Russian assets fall within the 245-plus objects the Kyiv Post identifies. For instance, many of those assets are likely storage units Russia uses to keep its troops supplied on the front lines in Ukraine. Taking these storage facilities out would mean Russia is less able to equip its troops on the ground. ATACMS strikes may also allow Ukraine to destroy Russian tanks and artillery units before they're deployed to the front, again relieving pressure on its soldiers in Donetsk. So the ATACMS isn't just a glide bomb destroyer. It's a missile that allows Ukraine to disrupt Russian supply lines that it couldn't previously reach. Timothy Ash, who's a Chatham House Associate Fellow, says as much when he tells Al Jazeera, Ukraine needs to be able to hit Russian supply chains, which it's moved back beyond current Ukrainian missile range. That's another good point. The Ukraine war's front lines now extend so deep into the Donbas region that Ukraine's short-range HIMARS rockets aren't even able to hit Russian positions inside its own territory. The 50-mile range doesn't allow it. With ATACMS, Ukraine can start by taking out Russia's logistical assets near the outskirts of its own country before moving on to tackle the many Russian objects the Kyiv Post mentions. Ash goes on to point out that simply having the ability to use ATACMS on Russian territory gives Ukraine something very important: leverage. That's what Ukraine wanted to create when it invaded Kursk, and it gets even more now it's able to use ATACMS. As Ash points out, Biden may have made his decision intending to deliver more leverage to Zelensky in future negotiations with Putin. Once the capability has been given, it's harder to take away, he notes. Putin will want to negotiate limits on Ukraine's military capabilities. If Zelensky and Putin ever do find themselves at the negotiating table, perhaps Ukraine's president can use his ATACMS to force Putin into reducing his use of glide bombs or pulling back from various regions in Donetsk. Therein may lie the main reason behind Biden granting approval to use ATACMS so late into his presidency. Ash says, it looks like Russia will escalate over the next couple of months before the Trump presidency and likely negotiations. It's already doing precisely that if his actions in Kursk are anything to go by. Introducing soldiers from another country in his special military operation is an escalation beyond anything we've seen Putin do since February 2022. So Ukraine needs to be able to hit longer range to dent Russia's offensive capabilities, Ash concludes. Notably, Trump has already called on Russia not to escalate the conflict any further. Putin ignored those calls, but that's unlikely to dissuade Trump from pushing for peace when he takes office in January 2025. Ukraine may welcome any negotiations Trump can mediate, but it'll want to enter those negotiations from a position of power, which means using ATACMS not just as leverage, but as a tool to weaken Russia in the 2 months before Trump takes office. Speaking of escalation, that's precisely what occurred in the wake of reports of Biden's decision. Before Ukraine's November 19 attack, Russia marked the 1,000th day of the war by changing up its nuclear doctrine. Now it says that any attack conducted by a non-nuclear state such as Ukraine, if backed by a nuclear power such as the US, will constitute a joint attack on Russia. And with that change, Putin has opened the door for Russia to use nukes in response to Ukraine's ATACMS usage. Will he go that far? Only time will tell. As for Zelensky, Biden's policy reversal is massive news for his country's brave military. It also takes him one step closer to enacting the victory plan he presented to the US back in October. If nothing else, Biden's move takes Ukraine one step closer to resolving things with Russia, be that on the battlefield or diplomatically. The latter seems to be Zelensky's preferred option as he awaits Donald Trump's arrival in office. The Hindu reported on an interview he gave to Ukrainian radio just days before Biden's policy reversal. "For our part, we must do everything we can to ensure that this war ends next year," Zelensky said. "We have to end it by diplomatic means." ATACMS trained on key Russian locations may give Ukraine the leverage it needs to do just that. But as Ukraine's November 19th strike demonstrates, Zelensky is far from shy about using his missiles to hit Russia where it hurts right now. So what do you think about Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to use the ATACMS on Russian targets? Will it allow Ukraine to negotiate a better deal for itself when Donald Trump becomes president and enact his peace plan? Or will Putin escalate from here, making the US regret its decision in the process? A Russian soldier is stationed inside a trench deep inside the Ukrainian region of Donetsk. Around him are more soldiers, all waiting for the command to storm the final mile stretch towards the next town. The battlefield is silent, except for the whir of small propellers overhead, like the sound of a small mosquito. Ukraine has started its counteroffensive. Seconds tick past agonizingly slowly as the soldier tries not to move, otherwise the drone's detection systems might pick them up and make him a prime target. The world, just like the soldier, stands still in those few moments as the whir moves back and forth, and then there's a boom. The soldier is alive, but the soldiers in the next trench weren't so lucky. The whirl of propellers grows distant as the drone retreats to be outfitted with another mine. You see, the Russian soldiers are not being bombed by long-range missiles or artillery. Instead, mines are being dropped on them by small drones, and ironically, the mines come from Russia itself. The Ukrainian military has made significant advancements in the way modern warfare is waged, and not by inventing new or more powerful weapons, but by repurposing old ones. In this case, the trick lies in using reliable and plentiful anti-tank mines not defensively, but offensively. The mine in question, the TM62, a Soviet-era anti-tank mine designed to be as simple and effective as possible. Weighing in at around 21 pounds, the TM62 contains around 17 pounds of explosive, usually TNT. It looks like a classic cartoon mine, a flat metal disc with a fuse on top. There are several different fuse types commonly used with the TM62, with the traditional pressure fuse being the most popular. Typically, the TM62s will be laid down by engineers and dug slightly into the ground, or deployed via a GMZ mine-laying vehicle to speed up the process. There's even a mine-laying helicopter that can cover huge swathes of ground with mines. But while the Ukrainians are also deploying the TM62 from the air with drones, the delivery method is quite different. In fact, it's another excellent example of Ukrainian wartime ingenuity. Rather than using traditional launchers and long-range artillery, Ukraine has started using drones as its primary ordnance delivery method, particularly as an anti-infantry and anti-tank tactic. Drone warfare isn't a particularly novel concept. It was first proposed all the way back in World War I, when both the US and the UK independently started development of the first military drones. But the first attempts were only partially successful. Early drones were no more than what would today be called glide bombs, explosives packed into a shell and put into a slightly more aerodynamic container that would either fly independently or be dropped from an airplane. These flying bombs were bulky and not particularly precise, which made them suboptimal, especially when deployed above Allied troops en route to the enemy. The chances of these bombs taking a sharp turn downwards and causing devastating losses from friendly fire was too great to ignore. As a result, drone development remained largely theoretical for the next several decades. The drone that you might be more familiar with is the American design that was used to great effect at the turn of the 21st century, particularly in the War on Terror. One of the hallmark models was the General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper, a remotely operated unmanned aerial vehicle or UAV in pretty much every sense. The drone looks more like a miniature airplane and has the ability to hold and deploy multiple missiles or bombs from its wing carriages. The drone's success in Afghanistan was mainly due to the enemy's lack of anti-air defenses and detection capabilities. This allowed the drones to fly pretty much unimpeded through enemy airspace and deliver their payloads effectively. But the war in Ukraine is being fought on a very different scale and thus requires a different type of drone. Enter the DJI Mavic, a series of commercial drones from China. These drones weren't designed for industry or wartime. They were meant to be simple and cost-effective cameras in the sky, with the ability to live stream a video feed to an accompanying device. They were designed for commercial purposes, to take photos and shoot videos for parties or advertisements. However, it quickly became clear that these small drones could be veritable powerhouses on the battlefield in Ukraine. These small quadcopter drones could be used to gather valuable information on enemy movements and formations. This is due to their being relatively silent, particularly compared to large aircraft or land vehicles. They're also maneuverable and, perhaps most importantly, cheap and abundant. Even some of the most sophisticated DJI Mavic models generally cost less than $2,000. This is an outrageously low price for military-grade equipment, especially considering the drone's versatility. So the Ukrainians started using the drone for more than just gathering intel, and that's how we arrived at the situation today, where drones are dropping anti-tank mines or grenades behind enemy lines. The construction of this deadly mechanism is relatively simple. It starts with the basic quadcopter drone, which is outfitted with a grappling system, typically custom-made or 3D printed to be as light as possible. The grappling system is designed to be released remotely by the drone operator, dropping its payload when the drone hovers over the target. Alternatively, the drone is outfitted with a latch that unhooks to release the ordnance when needed. A larger drone can also fit a tray made from a grill, such as those found in ovens, taped or strapped to the drone on one side and latched to the other. The mines lay flat on the grill. When the operator is ready to deploy the mine, they send a signal to unlatch the grill from the drone. In theory, the mine could fall flat onto the ground, provided that it's been dropped from a low height. But the DJI Mavic is a relatively small drone, incapable of hauling dozens of pounds of equipment, like an anti-tank mine. For this purpose, the Ukrainians have started domestic drone production using imported resources. The most common drone of this type is the so-called Vampire or Baba Yaga. This drone is based on another DJI design, the agricultural Agras T-line. Agras is a series of larger quadcopter drones, with the most recent models capable of carrying farming and fertilizing equipment weighing as much as 110 pounds. But considering the scale of the ordnance that Ukraine is working with, slightly older designs that can carry 50 to 100 pounds of equipment are perfectly suitable. The Ukrainians have adapted the base Agras chassis, or reverse-engineered the drones to fit 6 or 8 propellers. To improve their operational range to a couple of dozen miles, the Ukrainian drone designs add extra battery packs to the side of the drone and attach extra antennas to boost the drone's signal and allow multiple drones to combine their signals and data streams. The added gear has made the heavy drones slower and much less maneuverable than the base DJI Mavic. It also reduces the drone's maximum payload, with some specifications suggesting a limit of roughly 40 pounds. However, these drones can now carry modified TM62 mines or a host of other ordnance, such as grenades, mortar shells, or repurposed parts of anti-tank missiles. Additionally, the costs of making these drones are still significantly lower than dedicated seek-and-destroy military drones like the aforementioned MQ-9 Reaper. Plus, these drones have a vastly improved operational ceiling, able to hover at an altitude of 1,300 feet. So that's the drone covered. But what about the mine itself? Based on different images and videos circulating on social media, there are a few different mine designs in active use. Initial images showed mines with minimal modifications being held by drones, intending to be delivered directly onto the target. This is the most basic solution, but it's not that effective, as the mine's inertia and considerable weight can cause it to steer off target, especially if the drone is being deployed high above the ground. So the Ukrainians started modifying the mines. The most common modification adds a tail, so to speak, to one end of the mine in order to stabilize it. Typically, the tail is made from a PVC pipe with a piece of sawed-off plastic bottle at the end to mimic fans. This tail stabilizer causes the mine to fall roughly straight down and orient itself so that the modified fuse is typically the part that hits the ground first. The mine's fuse, which is traditionally a pressure plate designed to set off the mine at weights of between 330 and 1,100 pounds, can be replaced with an assortment of different fuses. For the drone's purposes, the most effective fuse detects changes in air pressure or impact, which detonate the mine when it reaches the ground. Alternatively, some videos indicate that these fuses have been replaced with traditional detonation fuses. This is supported by the fact that mines appear to have smoke rising from them as they fall, indicating that the fuse has been lit long before impact. This range of modifications, combined with multiple drone delivery systems, has allowed Ukraine to constantly stay one step ahead of Russia. If one type of system seems to have been solved by the enemy, the next drone can use a different fuse to change up the tactics and cause more confusion. This has been noted to be a particularly effective strategy in the ongoing war, in part because the Russian military has a stricter order and command structure than Ukraine's. Most Western strategists also consider the Russian military lacking in the ability to adapt to more nuanced, modern, or improved tactics. This is in sharp contrast to the Ukrainian military, which has been trained primarily by Western forces since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, which is considered to be one of the starting points of the ongoing conflict. Of course, the drones carrying mines aren't infallible. As mentioned, one of the main reasons the American drones had so much success in Iraq and Afghanistan was because the local insurgents didn't have meaningful anti-air defenses and detection capabilities. In Ukraine, the situation is practically reversed. Russia is widely considered to have some of the most sophisticated anti-air defense systems in the world, perhaps even matching those in the US for national defense purposes. Throughout the war in Ukraine, both sides of the conflict have contested the skies by means of relentless aerial attacks. To boot, the Russians are also well aware of the kinds of drone tactics that Ukraine can use, as the DJI Mavic and its close cousins, the agricultural drones, are imported from China into Russia too. Additionally, China has been Russia's closest ally throughout the conflict, with some reports suggesting China has been selling weapons and technology to Russia despite sanctions from the West, albeit without any concrete evidence having been produced to substantiate the claims. Thus, Russia has implemented robust anti-drone tactics itself, including detectors, jammers, and anti-air guns capable of detecting and shooting down drones before they can reach their target. Additionally, the constant seesaw of the front line in Donetsk makes operations near active combat much riskier for the Ukrainians due to their lower overall numbers. This means that drone operator squads have to deploy their drones farther away from the front, adding to the travel time and distance that the drones must cover before they can release their payloads. The battery packs that are added to domestic Vampire drones can compensate for the extra distance, but the combined weight of the drone and the mine it's carrying quickly nullifies the effect. It's estimated that for every drone that Russia shoots down, around 8 Ukrainian drones fail to reach their targets simply due to their batteries running dry. Still, the drones that do manage to reach Russian positions can have a devastating effect, particularly due to the sheer range of ordnance that Ukraine can use with them. In essence, the drone war in Ukraine is based on the cost-to-effect ratio. In particular, drones carrying anti-tank mines are typically used to destroy enemy armored vehicles or other specialized equipment. The drones are designed to be as cheap as possible, unlike their targets. While the cost of anti-tank mines is now approaching tens of thousands of dollars per unit, they are available by the truckload in Ukraine. On the other hand, a Russian tank can cost millions of dollars and much longer to produce. In fact, it could be argued that the advancements in drone warfare have directly caused Russia to abandon the prospects of developing its next-generation tank. The T-90M was supposed to be replaced with the T-14 Armata that had more offensive and defensive capabilities and integrated electronic warfare systems. However, only a dozen or so of these tanks were produced before the war started. When Russia deployed the new tanks to Ukraine, the results were disappointing. The tanks didn't display much more survivability than the T-90s, making them even more expensive pieces of metal for Ukraine to target with comparatively dirt-cheap equipment. If a $1 million tank can be destroyed with a basic anti-tank mine dropped from a drone that costs Ukraine a small fraction of the price and takes just a couple of days to make, Russia's ability to fund the war could quickly start drying up. But there's another cost that became one of the main reasons Ukraine has continued using drones to carry mines and other ordnance: people. By using a drone that can be operated from a dozen miles away, the Ukrainians can strike enemy infantry positions without risking their own personnel. Considering that Ukraine has less than a third of Russia's total population and likely under half of Russia's active military personnel, soldiers dying for Ukraine is much more costly than for Russia. The versatility provided by using modified drones and mines in this way goes beyond taking out enemy infantry. In fact, the mine doesn't even necessarily need to detonate upon impact. With some additional modifications to the stabilizer, the mine should be capable of falling from a relatively small height onto the ground, where it can stay dormant until an enemy vehicle drives over it. This method of mine delivery enables the Ukrainians to deploy mines in areas that traditional mine-laying squads can't reach, behind enemy lines. This has created a back-and-forth mine-based form of warfare in Donetsk. When the Russian military moves forward with its tanks and armored vehicles, it needs to clear a path through suspected minefields. No sooner has it done so, the Ukrainian military remines the same area with a fresh batch of mines, typically from the air. So the next time a new Russian convoy arrives or repositions itself in the area, there's a new supply of mines in place to cause mayhem for them once again. Using mines on a convoy of vehicles is particularly effective, as taking out the lead vehicle leaves its shell on the road, blocking the path for the rest of the convoy. The other vehicles are forced to reroute or retreat, with both options leaving them vulnerable to more mines. Moreover, the manual labor involved in trying to move the destroyed vehicle out of the way is typically not worth the time or danger, as the soldiers are sitting ducks for long-range strikes from Ukrainian forces. The TM62 mines are not only being deployed via drone either. Their ubiquity in the current war has led them to become one of the most common ordnances used in Ukraine. For example, a TM62 has more than enough explosive power to destroy an enemy fortification or collapse a building. When combined with a time-delayed fuse, the mine turns into a satchel charge that can be deployed by infantry when needed. All a soldier needs to do is get close to the enemy position, light the fuse, toss the mine, and get clear of the ensuing explosion ASAP. Videos circulating on Telegram show multiple cases of troops using the TM62 in this way. The main targets in the videos so far seem to be trenches and buildings, where they're used to destroy fortified positions or kill the enemy infantry stationed in them. However, it should be noted that when anti-tank mines are used in this way, whether by drone or as a satchel charge, the targets are usually not tanks, ironically. This is due to the fact that even the larger Vampire drone is able to carry only a single mine. If the drone targets a vehicle and ends up missing, it doesn't have any more ordnance to drop. Mortar shells, on the other hand, typically weigh only a few pounds, and the Vampire drones can carry 3 or 4 of them at a time. Should a mortar shell miss the target, the drone can take a few minutes to reposition and then drop its other payload before flying off to evade the enemy's counterattack. Another reason for mines not being useful in some scenarios is their larger explosion radius. When used as a satchel charge, the mine creates a much larger explosion than traditional ordnance. If the fuse is set to a low timer, as some of the videos showing Russians using the tech indicate, there's a high risk that the operator will get caught by the blast or its after effects. For drone operations, this also means the drone has to fly at a height of at least several hundred feet above the target. The extra height greatly decreases the accuracy, but improves the drone's survivability. Against a moving target, however, the loss of accuracy can mean that the entire operation is a waste of time and money. Besides, the anti-tank mine is not even the best weapon to drop on tanks. This might seem counterintuitive, but it has to do with how Soviet tanks were designed. The T-line of the Soviet tanks, ending with the most recent T-90, all have heavily reinforced armor around and on top of the vehicle. When a drone drops an anti-tank mine, the mine's weight and inertia mean it's unlikely to hit the tank directly. While the explosive charge is potent, it might not be sufficient to destroy a tank if it strikes it indirectly. On the other hand, Russian tanks use an autoloader system for their main armaments. The system stores spare ammunition in a compartment below the main turret, keeping it away from the crew members. While this means that the tank can fire more rapidly and doesn't need a separate crew member to reload the tank, the compartment itself becomes a potential weak spot. Since it sits closer to the ground, an anti-tank mine detonated below the tank or a mortar shell dropping directly on the chassis below the turret can cause enough of a shockwave to detonate the tank's ammunition. Depending on how much ammunition the tank has left in the loader, the resulting explosion can completely obliterate the vehicle from the inside out. That's why the Ukrainians have used even smaller DJI Mavic drones with mortar shells to target tanks and vehicles specifically. This strategy shifts the cost-to-effect ratio even further in Ukraine's favor, since the small drones are much more readily available and can easily be replaced. In fact, there are estimates that Ukraine might be losing 10,000 drones per month, with roughly the same number in the air over Ukraine at any point during the war. This demonstrates how big an impact drones are making in modern warfare. Particularly since drones are much easier to replace than people, they're being used as both eyes in the sky and arms that drop bombs. But how do these drones locate their targets in the first place? The answer is, perhaps unsurprisingly, with even more drones. The Vampire drones don't have to be attack drones. Their improved antennas make them excellent signal boosters for short-range reconnaissance drones, a role that the DJI Mavics can readily fill if needed. Furthermore, Ukraine has its own industry producing long-range surveillance drones, the SKYROCKET. SKYROCKET Raybird 3 is a drone designed back in 2014 for intel and reconnaissance missions, and was adopted by Ukraine's armed forces shortly after. The Raybird 3 has an operational range of over 1,000 miles, and is capable of flying for more than a day without needing to recharge. Furthermore, it only needs to be within 60 to 100 miles of a control center to receive active orders, meaning that it can fly about 60 miles behind enemy lines to scout for targets. The drone can also fly at altitudes of up to 11,500 feet, easily bypassing common anti-air defense systems, looking for drones closer to the ground. A photo appeared on Russian social media, showing a Raybird that had been felled near the Krasnodar region, which was around 130 miles behind the front line at the time the picture was taken. This indicates that the drone can feasibly operate even deeper into Russian territory. But the Raybird 3 is just one of the pieces that powers Ukraine's drone-based surveillance system, with real-time communications again reserved for the ever-present DJI Mavics. This system means that Ukraine can keep an eye on both current events on the front and incoming Russian supply lines to scout for potential targets. Once viable targets have been identified, the Vampires and smaller drones with grenades can be deployed to perform repeated drop-down attacks. The sheer scale of drone warfare in Ukraine creates disturbing implications for the future of modern conflict. Tens of thousands of drones working in tandem to create real-time coverage of practically the entire front line would mean that nobody on the battlefield is safe from death from above. Now consider that Ukraine started the war significantly on the back foot. The Raybird 3 is estimated to cost $450,000. That's a hefty sum, but pales in comparison with the famous MQ-9 Reaper, which has a price tag of over $30 million per unit. A country with a larger economy and military defense budget, like most NATO members, could easily replicate Ukraine's successful use of drones to create veritable drone armies. Drone operators could undergo years of training on simulations or even in real-life scenarios, making them much more common than in the Ukrainian and Russian armed forces currently. All of these factors combined could, and arguably should, inspire NATO members to rapidly modernize their military forces to include multiple kinds of drones. With drones at the helm of conducting offensive missions, the potential loss of lives of friendly troops is likely to be greatly minimized, and this could be the great equalizer in modern warfare. Considering China has an active military force of 2.3 million troops, while the US has only 1.3 million soldiers. A larger supply of drones and more advanced military technology could more than compensate for the disadvantage in manpower. But for now, the world will watch on as drone warfare improves by the year in Ukraine. Maybe the Ukrainians are building an even better version of the Vampire as we speak, ready to turn the tide of war once again. But what do you think? Will drones be able to save Ukraine in the war? And how will drone warfare impact the militaries of the future? You can't use our long-range missiles to attack Russia on its own territory. Time and time again, this is the message that the West has delivered to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky when he's asked to use British Storm Shadow and American ATACMS missiles against Russia. The refusals were based on a good reason. Striking Russia in its territory has long been considered a red line in the Ukraine war. Doing so with missiles provided by Western countries would be even worse, with Russia possibly taking such strikes as one provocation too far. World War III might be the consequence if Ukraine uses the West's long-range missiles in Russia. Zelensky's arguments to the contrary have fallen on deaf ears for over 2.5 years, but now everything has changed. Ukraine finally has permission to use Western-made long-range missiles in Russia. The move represents a massive turnaround in the way the West has approached Putin's special military operation, and it could mean one of two things. Either Ukraine now has a weapon that could help it win the war, or we're all on the verge of a global conflict that Putin has been threatening since the beginning. In this video, we're going to explore the approval Ukraine has supposedly received from the West, as well as the risks posed by the use of these missiles inside Russia. It all starts with the approval. On September 11, 2024, The Guardian reported on hints that the West was on the verge of lifting its restrictions on long-range missile use in Russia. During a meeting with Zelensky in Kyiv, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken claimed that the US has been willing to adapt its policy when it comes to how Ukraine uses the weapons it provides from day one, and that it would continue to adapt as needed. Further comments from British Foreign Secretary David Lammy seem to suggest that such an adaptation would be discussed in Kyiv. Lammy pointed toward Iran dispatching ballistic missiles to Russia as a significant and dangerous escalation that forced a change in strategic thinking in both the UK and the US. The message appeared to be clear. Russia is intent on using foreign missiles in Ukraine, so perhaps it's about time Ukraine could do the same with Russia. However, the conference between Zelensky and his two compatriots came and went with no formal announcement. From the outside, it still appears that Ukraine doesn't have permission to use British or American long-range missiles in Russia. But reports have started to emerge suggesting otherwise. True, there had been no official announcement, the Kyiv Independent claimed on September 12th. However, that didn't mean anything because the UK had already privately decided to allow Ukraine to use its Storm Shadow missiles for long-range strikes in Russia. The newspaper's report cited anonymous UK officials who claimed that discussions took place behind the scenes of the September 11th press conference had proven fruitful for Zelensky. In fact, the entire press conference that served as the public face of these discussions wouldn't have taken place at all if not for a change in policy on missile usage. Euromaidan Press published a similar report on September 12th, stating that the joint visit of Blinken and Lamy to Kyiv offered a strong indication of the decision to allow the use of long-range weapons. A later report by The Guardian on September 14th suggested that British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is pressing US President Joe Biden to back his plans to allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles to strike Russia. Look beyond the diplomatic wrangling and it seems likely that Ukraine had in fact received permission to use Storm Shadow missiles however it sees fit. That permission isn't official. The UK hasn't come out publicly to say that Ukraine can use its missiles inside Russia, but behind the public diplomatic wrangling, discussions have taken place that appear to have resulted in Ukraine being allowed to finally cross one of Putin's biggest red lines. Which brings us to a key question: why do Storm Shadow missiles even matter? After all, Ukraine has received billions of dollars in military aid during Putin's special military operation, which has already included Storm Shadows. It's been using the missiles too, focusing Storm Shadow strikes on Russian military positions in Crimea. If Ukraine already has these missiles, why is it such a big deal that it's being allowed to use them to strike targets inside Russia? To answer that question, we need to understand what a Storm Shadow missile is. The result of a joint effort by the UK and France to develop a new long-range missile, Storm Shadow is a long-range cruise missile that can be launched from ships, submarines, and aerial platforms. Each missile measures 16.7 feet and has a launch weight of 2,866 pounds, 881 pounds of which is a high-explosive warhead capable of penetrating defenses to ensure the missile hits its target. We've seen this in Crimea already. Storm Shadows have been able to break through the roofs and similar defenses of Russian military installations in that annexed region to wreak destruction. The BBC dubs the missile the ideal weapon for penetrating hardened bunkers and ammunition stores, such as those used by Russia in the Ukraine war. The missiles are powered by a turbojet propulsion system, allowing them to reach speeds of over 600 miles per hour. However, it's the missile's range that makes it such a threat to Putin. A Storm Shadow can travel for up to 155 miles, meaning that each $1 million missile is capable of striking targets far beyond the front lines established in the Ukraine war. That's why these missiles matter so much to Ukraine. As the BBC reports, Ukrainian cities on the front lines of the war face constant bombardment from Russian missiles, drones, and glide bombs. The latter is especially devastating. In March 2024 alone, Russia dropped 3,000 glide bombs on Ukraine. These Soviet-era bombs weigh hundreds of pounds and have been equipped with fold-out wings and satellite navigation systems that allow them to glide to a target while evading anti-air defenses that are tuned to take out missiles and drones. Each of these glide kits costs between $20,000 and $30,000, giving Russia a cost-effective way to destroy Ukrainian cities without burning through far more expensive missiles. The key to these glide bombs is that Russia can launch them from behind the front lines. Its planes don't need to cross over into Ukraine, meaning Ukraine is helpless to stop them while operating under the long-range missile restrictions that have been placed on it for most of the war. The BBC even notes several claims that Russia's military air bases were better protected than the average Ukrainian citizen because of these restrictions being in place. With permission to use Storm Shadows, Ukraine can finally hit back against these air bases and quell the flow of glide bombs into the country. The Institute for the Study of War points out that Storm Shadows would allow Ukraine to directly strike up to 200 Russian air bases and ammunition stores, many of which lie within Russian territory behind the border it shares with Ukraine. Several key Russian regions, including Kursk, Belgorod, and Rostov-on-Don, would become targets, with Kursk and Belgorod already being subjected to Ukrainian invasions in recent weeks. With Storm Shadow attacks, Ukraine could take out both ammunition stores and Russian troops arriving to thwart its incursions in these regions, effectively securing a new front line within Russian territory. So we have two reasons why the UK granting permission to use Storm Shadows inside Russia is so important. With these missiles, Ukraine can take out glide bomb stores and the air bases being used to launch these devastating weapons, providing much-needed relief from aerial attacks for its cities on the front lines. Secondly, Storm Shadows could serve as key support weapons for the Ukrainian troops invading Kursk and Belgorod. The missiles could take out key Russian installations and limit Putin's responses to those invasions, giving Ukrainian soldiers on the ground more time to build fortifications and secure the territory they've taken. But there's more. According to ABC News, Ukraine also sees Storm Shadows as a potential catalyst for seizing the initiative from Russia as the war enters a third year. Russia's steady advance into Ukraine is likely to slow down when winter comes, Having long-range airstrike capabilities allows Ukraine to take advantage of that slowdown, as it can use storm shadows to take out supply depots and communication centers with pinpoint strikes, thereby preventing Russia from organizing future assaults in the spring of 2025 and beyond. Those strikes could limit Russian air superiority, particularly when it comes to the previously mentioned glide bombs, and could even open the door for Ukraine to create pockets of air superiority of its own. In that sense, storm shadows could be an ideal support tool for the dozens of F-16 fighter jets set to enter Ukraine in 2025. The missiles could take out Russian air bases near the front lines, leaving the F-16s, or indeed any other fighter jets Ukraine decides to use, free to support troops on the ground as they push Russia back. At the very least, storm shadows could create breaks in Russia's supply lines, damaging its logistical capabilities to the point where its troops aren't receiving the equipment they need. In short, storm shadows give Ukraine breathing room. They present a clear attacking threat to Russia that will force Putin to push some of his most destructive assets further behind the front lines, making them less of a threat to Ukraine in the process. The problem, as well as the reason why Ukraine has been so slow to permit Ukraine to use storm shadows inside Russia, is that Putin has been making threats. Lots of them. The use of long-range missiles in Russia has long been one of Putin's red lines, actions most believe would provoke Russia into becoming more aggressive. He's made repeated claims that he would consider the use of Storm Shadow missiles inside his territory as tantamount to a declaration of war by NATO against his country. Those claims were reiterated on September 12, 2024, when reports of the UK secretly allowing Ukraine to use Storm Shadows emerged. That will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are fighting Russia, he claimed. Al Jazeera also reported on Putin's claims that permission to use the first missiles would amount to direct involvement of NATO countries, while adding that the Russian leader believes this would change the very nature of the conflict. While the exact nature of this threat is unclear, it appears that Putin was saying that escalation will result from storm shadows being used in Russia, just as he's claimed for every red line that Ukraine has crossed during the special military operation. More threats came from Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who said that Russia believes that Starmer and Biden have already struck a deal to permit Ukraine to use long-range missiles in Russia. Peskov's threat was as vague as most that Russia has made during the war, with the spokesman simply saying that the Russian response will be appropriate. It all adds up to a potential flashpoint between Russia and NATO. If Putin is to be believed, any use of Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia would be tantamount to an escalation at best and a full-blown declaration of war at worst. And if Russia's president feels like NATO is starting to truly represent a threat to his position as his country's strongman leader, there's no telling what he might do in response. Make no mistake about it, there are clear and serious risks involved in allowing Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles. It would be naive to think otherwise. Counterfire made this clear in an article published on September 17, 2024, just days after the news of UK's supposed approval of Storm Shadow emerged. It mentions that the British government has championed vociferously the use of these missiles, no doubt spurred on by Putin's May 2024 threats of retaliation after the UK allowed Ukraine to use other British weapons inside Russia. That event caused UK Ambassador Nigel Casey to be summoned to the Kremlin, where he was told that British military facilities and equipment in Ukrainian territory and abroad could face the full wrath of Russia's military might if it didn't retract its permission. The UK issued no retraction. Russia hasn't attacked Britain. But the fact that such an unambiguous threat was made against the UK has spurred many in the country into believing that Ukraine needs to be able to use Storm Shadow missiles in Russia to lessen the threat that Putin poses beyond Ukraine. However, the website also points out that not all in the West support the idea. It notes that Starmer and Biden failed to provide explicit permission for Storm Shadow usage during their meeting on September 13th, suggesting hesitancy on at least Washington's end. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz has also shown hesitation, refusing to supply Ukraine with any of his country's Taurus missiles, which are cruise missiles with a range of around 300 miles. Why the hesitation? It doesn't all come down to the threats Putin has made relating to these long-range missiles. Counterfire points out that though Ukraine using Storm Shadow missiles will force Russia to move its military depots and aircraft deeper into Russia, it's unlikely to do much to relieve Russian pressure in the Donbas region. That part of the conflict is primarily fought on the ground, with some air support coming from the previously mentioned glide bombs. Even if those bombs go away, Russia still has the advantage in manpower and ammunition production, with the country producing 3 artillery shells for each one the West produces. Ukraine's priority in Donbas, the outlet argues, is mobilizing enough soldiers to halt the Russian advance, rather than using long-range missiles to strike inside Russia. So a tactical element comes into play. Some Western countries are hesitant to deliver long-range missiles to Ukraine, not because they're especially worried about Russia's response, but because they feel the missiles won't make much of a difference. Remember that each of these missiles can easily cost $1 million or more. The German Taurus costs $1.1 million per unit. Perhaps Scholz believes his country's money is better spent on equipment that Ukraine can put to better use in the Donbass. Still, it's unwise to ignore the risk of escalation. Counterfire points out that some in the West are operating on the logic that Putin is all bluster and no follow-through. His actions up to this point seem to prove their case. Putin's threats of reprisals and nuclear Armageddon have extended to F-16s arriving in Ukraine, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and even the supply of tanks to Ukraine. All of those things have happened without the Russian president pushing the nuclear button. Providing Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine would likely merit the same response: no major escalation. The problem with this logic is that Russia has been escalating, Counterfire claims. It's just been doing it slower than the West expected. The escalation has so far remained under control, with Russia strengthening its attacks in response to each of its red lines being crossed. In the case of Storm Shadow missiles, their use in Russia may require significant direct logistical support from the West, which Putin and many in the West may view as equivalent to the West actively getting involved in the war. Scholz himself has claimed that British troops have helped Ukraine with target control for the Storm Shadow missiles used in Crimea, with Putin parroting that argument. The British deny it, but the simple fact that there's such confusion over British involvement creates a danger. There are also fears over the targets Ukraine might choose now it has free rein to use Storm Shadow missiles. Military depots and airfields are one thing, but what if Ukraine turns its attention to Russia's nuclear sector, civilian targets? What if Ukraine gets an eye for an eye approach and starts attacking cities directly with Western-made missiles? That would create a diplomatic firestorm that allows Putin to claim that the West is committing war crimes against the Russian people by enabling these attacks. As hypocritical as that would be given Putin's actions in the war, Russia killed or wounded 30,457 civilians during the first 2 years of the conflict, the Russian leader would believe he's justified in escalating further if Ukraine used Storm Shadows on civilian population centers. Of course, much of this is speculative. Ukraine likely won't use Storm Shadows to attack civilians or nuclear infrastructure. Given the clandestine nature of the approval it's received, there may have been specific conditions barring them from doing so. But the mere fact that these concerns exist, coupled with the Kremlin's capacity for spinning almost anything into pro-Russian propaganda, means there are clear risks attached to using these missiles inside Russia. In a September 22, 2024 article, CNN also makes the point that the battlefield dividends of Storm Shadow missiles are less than clear. It points out that US intelligence suggests that around 90% of the Russian aircraft used to launch glide bombs are situated at least 186 miles away from Ukrainian territory, putting them out of the reach of Storm Shadow missiles. The relocation of many of these planes deeper into Russia puts them even further out of reach. That might be the point for Zelensky, who would argue that forcing those Russian installations back makes them less effective and gives his soldiers more time to react to incoming glide bombs. Still, moving these airfields deeper inside Russia also means that Ukraine can't use Storm Shadows to destroy them. CNN also points out that even in the absence of these targets, Ukraine can still hit ammo depots and military headquarters with its Storm Shadow missiles, meaning some battlefield utility exists. George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War also notes that the mere threat of permission being granted means Russian aircraft are being pushed further away from the border. The natural consequence is that those aircraft will run fewer bombing missions, while giving Ukraine extra detection and reaction time to deal with incoming bombs and missiles, just as Zelensky wants. Others argue that Ukraine could use Storm Shadows to take out Russian air defense systems. Matthew Saville, who serves as the Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute, says, "If you punch a hole through, actually Ukrainian long-range drones have got better options to penetrate deeper into Russia." This approach would see Storm Shadow missiles play more of a supporting role for Ukraine. They take out the anti-air defenses, clearing the path for the mass drone attacks that have proven so successful for Ukraine so far. More drones means more ground cleared, opening the door for ground troops to establish control in key areas. There's also another possibility. Ukraine being able to use Storm Shadows in Russia could give it leverage in future negotiations. Counterfire makes that point while noting that there's steadily growing support for negotiations within Ukraine following Ukraine's failed counteroffensive of 2023. In July 2024, the Ukrainian think tank Razumkov Center polled 2,027 people on the issue, finding that 44% of the respondents supported opening talks to end the war. A further 21% said they were unsure, with 35% saying now is not the time to negotiate. There is a caveat to these results. Most Ukrainians don't believe those negotiations would create a lasting peace. Over 80% believe that Putin would only accept an end to the conflict on his terms, which would likely mean Russia claiming the territory it currently holds in the Donbass and Mariupol. Those terms are unacceptable to the vast majority of Ukrainians, the poll claims, suggesting Ukrainian people believe that the country is stuck when it comes to negotiating. Ukraine needs more leverage if it's going to get what it wants out of these negotiations. So from Ukraine's perspective, there's little point in even starting talks until that leverage is in place. Ukraine's recent incursions into Kursk and Belgorod could provide some of that leverage, especially now that Ukraine holds over 450 square miles of territory in the former. Perhaps adding the threat of Storm Shadow missiles could provide the leverage Ukraine needs to negotiate for a complete end to the war that sees Russia keep none of the territory that it's taken. Again, it's all speculation. The only thing that seems certain is that the UK has permitted Ukraine to use Storm Shadows in Russia, albeit without making any sort of public announcements relating to that usage. But is that even certain? On September 21, 2024, Le Monde published an article claiming that the supposed permission to use Storm Shadow missiles in Russia hasn't actually been granted. It quotes Zelensky, who told reporters that neither America nor the United Kingdom gave us permission to use these weapons on the territory of Russia on any targets at any distance. He adds that he believes that both are worried about an escalation in the wake of Putin's renewed threats that a war with NATO will result from the use of Storm Shadow. That claim throws a wrench into the works. On the one hand, it seems to support what we're seeing from the public-facing side of this missile controversy. After all, the UK and US haven't given official permission for the use of their long-range missiles in Russia, and that lack of permission likely boils down to what Zelensky claims, fear of Russian reprisal. On the other hand, Zelensky may be simply upholding the ruse. The permission to use Storm Shadow missiles has apparently been granted privately, so Ukraine's leader claiming not to have that permission could be part of the deal. Don't claim to have the go-ahead, but use the missiles as you see fit. If the latter is the case, you'd have to imagine the smokescreen will evaporate the first time Ukraine uses a Storm Shadow to take out a target in Russia. There's one more possible reason why Britain has permitted Ukraine to use Storm Shadow. Ukraine may be using the missiles to buy time. In December 2023, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Ivan Havryluk, claimed that Ukraine was working on a modification to its self-made Neptune missiles to give them long-range capabilities. Forbes military writer David Axe says that these modifications focus on extending the physical length of the Neptune, creating more space in which Ukraine can add fuel. That extra fuel could give the anti-ship missiles a 250-mile range, roughly equivalent to the Storm Shadow. So perhaps the goal of allowing Ukraine to use Storm Shadows in Russia isn't merely to give Ukraine more offensive capabilities. The UK could be buying time for Ukraine, allowing it to present a long-range threat through Western weapons while it works on developing its own missiles and ensuring it has the infrastructure needed to ramp up production at home. Where does all of this leave the situation between Russia and NATO? It's difficult to say. While various outlets claim Ukraine can use Storm Shadow missiles in Russia, there's no official confirmation from the UK. Without confirmation, it's difficult to predict how far Ukraine will go with the Storm Shadows it has left in stock. Putin is obviously wary. He's reinforced his threats of war between Russia and NATO if those missiles are used to strike targets within Russian territory. But he could also be bluffing. He's made similar threats about other red lines being crossed before, but has not expanded his special military operation outside of Ukraine yet. If nothing else, the permission to use Storm Shadows inside Russia makes Ukraine more of a threat to Putin, which could give Zelensky leverage in future peace talks, while at the same time buying Ukraine time to develop its own missiles. But what do you think about all of this? Has Britain really permitted Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia? Or does the lack of an official announcement mean Ukraine still faces restrictions on missile usage? How do you think Putin will react if a Storm Shadow is used to destroy a target in Russia?